Section 11 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Jennifer Painter. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Arthur, Duke of Wellington, by L. Drake, 1769 to 1852. Arthur Wellesley, the fourth son of the Earl of Mornington, was born on May 1, 1769, at Dungan Castle in Ireland. Although exhibiting no decided inclination for the profession of arms, a soldier's career was chosen for him at an early age, and after some preparatory years spent at Eton, he was sent to Angers in France to learn in its ancient military school those lessons in the art of war which he was destined in after life again and again so gloriously to surpass. Unlike his contemporary Napoleon, the genius of Wellington did not display itself beyond enabling him to attain a fair and creditable proficiency at Angers. On his return to England, he was gazetted to an ensigncy early in 1787, and 5 years later, having passed through the intermediate degrees, he obtained a troop in the 18th Light Dragoons. His first appearance in public life was as a statesman, having been returned to the Irish Parliament for the borough of Trim. His military career of active service commenced by his being ordered, with his regiment, to join the army in the Netherlands. Ere he reached it, the tide of victory was running against the British arms, and his opening campaign, while it gave him much experience, brought him but little glory. He had now obtained the rank of colonel, and, as commander of the rear guard of the army, he steadily covered its retreat before the advancing troops of the French Republic, till they crossed the frontiers of the Low Countries, when, after a kindly welcome and a short stay with the Bremeners, they returned home. The worn-out regiments were immediately recruited, and in April 1796 Colonel Wellesley sailed with his corps for the East Indies, where he arrived in February the following year. The fall of Seringapatam and the death of Tipu Saib in its defence are well-known events. The principal command of the army in India was soon entrusted to Colonel Wellesley, and early next year he was gazetted Major General. The nature of this sketch will not admit of a detailed account of the rest of the campaign, although it proved a short but brilliant one which ended in the entire submission of the Maratha potentates, who continued the struggle after Tipu's fall, and completely established the reputation of the future hero of Waterloo. A staff command awaited Major General, and now Sir Arthur, Wellesley's return to England, and soon afterward he married Catherine, the third daughter of the Earl of Longford. The command of a detachment of the army sent against the French in Spain and Portugal was confided to Sir Arthur in June 1808, when, without delay, he proceeded to Corunna. The successes of the earlier portion of the campaign, owing to the admirable conduct of Sir Arthur, were so well appreciated at home that the King raised him to the peerage. Through many difficulties, Lord Wellington still continued to lead the Allied army on from victory to victory, to relate which, even briefly, would alone fill a volume, till he found himself ready for the last grand struggle at Ciudad Rodrigo, which was now occupied by the French. It was early in January 1811, yet notwithstanding the coldness of the weather and the dangers to which the army was exposed, in case of the sudden rising of the river Agueda, which runs nearly in front of the town, the preliminaries of the siege were successfully conducted. One afternoon, the breaching batteries, comprising 27 large guns, opened their fire on the wall of the town. In 5 days the breaches were practicable, and a summons to surrender was sent to the governor. This he declined doing. Wellington, having personally examined the breaches, felt convinced that an assault had every prospect of success. Ordering the fire of the guns to be directed against the cannon on the ramparts, he sat down on an embankment and wrote the order of assault which was to seal the doom of the town, beginning with the emphatic sentence, "The attack upon Ciudad Rodrigo must be made this evening at 7 o'clock." Spain and Portugal conferred honours on the conqueror of Rodrigo, and at home he was raised to the earldom of Wellington, with an increased annuity of £2,000 a year. The French army under Marshal Soult had at length been compelled to quit Spain, and with such speed that in 4 days they passed over ground which it took the allied armies 7 days to traverse. During the retreat the two armies approached each other several times, and on one occasion, when the French army was crossing the plains of Gurs, its pursuers followed so closely that had it not been for the thick woods through which they had to pass, Soult's retreat would have been seriously endangered by the British cavalry. When Bonaparte had quitted Fontainebleau and had embarked on board the Undaunted frigate for Elba, Lord Wellington felt he might safely leave the army for a time, and, setting out for Paris, he reached it May the 4th. He met with an enthusiastic reception from all classes, while the unqualified praises of each of the allied sovereigns showed how much the successful issue of the struggle to restore liberty to Europe was due to his talents and constancy of purpose. The restored Spanish king, Ferdinand, sent him a letter of gratitude, and the Crown Prince of Sweden gave him the Order of the Sword. England at the same time conferred upon him the dukedom he so long enjoyed, and raised 5 of his lieutenants to peerages. Once more the loud, shrill clarion of war aroused Europe to arms. 10 short months after his abdication, Napoleon, escaped from Elba, was again in Paris, resolved to incur all risks in order to gain the greatest prize in Europe, the crown he had so lately relinquished. The magic influence of his name spread through France, which became one vast camp, and in an incredibly short space of time, Napoleon found himself ready to take the field with an army of 150,000 men, of whom 20,000 were highly disciplined cavalry. The whole army was perfectly equipped, while 300 pieces of cannon formed an overpowering artillery. To oppose this well-appointed force, the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blucher had collected an army of 180,000 men. But although the allied armies thus exceeded Napoleon's in numbers, his consisted of veteran troops of one nation, while theirs were composed, for the most part, of raw levies. That under the Duke was the weakest and the worst. At no time did it reach 80,000 men, and on one half of these only could reliance be placed in the day of battle. "I am going to have a brush with Wellington," said Napoleon on the evening of June the 11th, 1815, and next morning before daybreak he set out to join his army on the frontiers, taking every precaution to conceal from Wellington that he was coming. Napoleon's object was to separate Blucher from Wellington, then to deal with each singly, and thus to crush them forever. Then France, rejoicing to see glory once more resting on her eagles, would again hail him as her emperor. While at dinner, Wellington received the first news of the advance of Napoleon. Thinking that this was merely a feint to draw the Allies towards Ligny, while a serious attempt was made upon Brussels, Wellington, who had already prepared himself for any emergency, determined to wait till Napoleon's object was more fully displayed. While, therefore, he gave orders that the troops should be in readiness to march at a moment's notice, he, with his officers, joined in the festivities of a ball given that evening by the Duchess of Richmond. Blucher's second courier arrived before 12 o'clock, and the dispatches were delivered to the Duke in the ballroom. While he was reading them, he seemed completely absorbed by their contents, and after he had finished, for some minutes he remained in the same attitude of deep reflection, totally abstracted from every surrounding object, while his countenance was expressive of fixed and intense thought. He was heard to mutter to himself, "Marshal Blucher thinks. It is Marshal Blucher's opinion." And after remaining thus abstracted a few minutes, and having apparently formed his decision, he gave his usual clear and concise orders to one of his staff officers, who instantly left the room, and was again as gay and animated as ever. He stayed to supper, and then went home. The trumpet's loud call awoke every sleeper in the city of Brussels a little after midnight. Then it became known that the French had advanced to Charleroi, which they had taken, and that the English troops were ordered to advance and support the Prussians. Instantly the place resounded with martial preparations, and as soldiers were quartered in every house, the whole town became one bustling scene. At daylight the troops were under arms, and at 8 o'clock set out for Quatre Bras, the expected scene of action in advance of Charleroi, the 5th Division taking the direct road through the forest of Soigny. Early in the afternoon Marshal Ney attacked the Prince of Orange, and by an overwhelming superiority of troops was driving him back through a thick wood called Les Bois des Bossons, when the leading columns of the English reached Quatre Bras. Wellington's eye at once saw the critical condition of his ally, and, though the troops had marched 20 miles under a sultry sky, he knew their spirit was indomitable, and gave the welcome order that the wood must be immediately regained. On came Ney's infantry, doubling that of his opponents in number, supported by a crashing fire of artillery, quickly followed by the cavalry, which, dashing through the rye crops more than breast high, charged the English regiments as soon as they reached the battleground. Yet, though unable properly to establish themselves, they formed squares and roughly repelled the enemy. Fierce and frequent were the efforts of the French to break the squares. Showers of grape poured upon them, and the moment an opening appeared, on rushed the lancers. But the dead were quickly removed, and, though the squares were lessened, they still presented an unbroken line of glittering bayonets, which neither the spears of the lancers nor the long swords of the cuirassiers could break through. A division of the guards from Enghien, coming up at this crisis, gallantly charged the enemy, and in half an hour cleared the wood of them completely. This exploit was remarkable, achieved as it was by young soldiers after a toilsome march of 15 hours, during which time they had been without anything to eat or drink. The fire of the French artillery and the charges of cavalry obliged these gallant fellows, although now joined by the Brunswickers, in some measure to keep the shelter of the wood. They, however, sallied out at intervals, until Ney, finding himself shaken, sent for his reserve. This force Napoleon had unexpectedly removed to support his attack on the Prussians at Ligny. Yet the Marshal maintained his position to the close of the day, when he fell back on the road to Frasnes, while the British and their brave allies lighted fires, and securing such provisions as they could, after a scanty meal, piled arms, and lay down to rest on the battlefield. Napoleon's simultaneous attack on the Prussians at Ligny was for a long time doubtful. Both Blucher and Napoleon were compelled to bring their reserves into action, and when night closed, Blucher, still, like a wounded lion, fought with ferocity, but the darkness enabled Napoleon to wheel a division of French infantry on the rear of the Prussians, while a dense body of cuirassiers forced Ligny on the other side, and not till then did Blucher fall back. Wellington was prepared to accept battle at daybreak next morning, but hearing of Blucher's retreat, he also resolved to fall back, so as to keep a lateral communication with the right wing of the Prussians, and by this movement also prevent Bonaparte from placing himself between the two armies, when at his choice he might turn his forces against either, in which case the inferiority of numbers would have entailed certain defeat. Napoleon expected to find the English army still upon the ground it had occupied on the 16th. Great was his surprise when, on reaching the heights above Frasne, he saw that the troops at the entrance of the wood were only a strong rearguard, and that the retreat toward Brussels was already half effected. He bitterly rebuked Ney for his supposed negligence, though Wellington's own officers did not imagine they were to retreat till the moment it began, and the Duke, by dexterously wheeling his troops round the wood, part of which could only be seen by the French, gave their marshal the idea that he was bringing up large reinforcements instead of drawing off his troops. The French squadrons immediately commenced the pursuit, but were so rudely handled by the Life Guards under Lord Uxbridge, who protected the rear, that, after several attacks, in the last of which the French hussars were charged and nearly cut to pieces, the pursuit was so severely checked as to give the infantry ample time to take up the ground appointed them on the heights of Mont Saint Jean, covering the approach to Brussels by the great road from Charleroi. Here it was that the Duke had determined to make his final stand, staking the glory of many years on the issue of a single battle. When day broke and Napoleon beheld his opponents, whom he feared would have escaped him during the night, fearlessly occupying their position of the evening before, and evidently prepared to defend it, a flush of joy overspread his face, while he exclaimed confidently, "Bravo! I have them then, these English!" By 9 o'clock the weather moderated, the sun shone out, fires were kindled, the men dried and cleaned their arms, and, ammunition being served out, provisions were distributed, and the men breakfasted with some degree of comfort. Since daybreak, occasional shots had been fired, but not till 11 o'clock did the battle begin. A body of light troops left the French line, and, descending the hill at a sling trot, broke into scattered parties, keeping up an irregular fire as they advanced towards the Chateau of Hougoumont. These were closely followed by 3 divisions, nearly 30,000 strong, and the dropping fire was soon changed into one continued roll of musketry. As the English skirmishers fell back, 2 brigades of British artillery opened on the advancing columns of the French, each shot plunging and tearing through their masses, while the shells from the howitzers fell so truly that the shaken columns drew back. But now a powerful artillery opened from the French heights, fresh troops poured forward, and for more than an hour the line of each army remained spectators of the terrific attack on the chateau, surrounded by a dense cloud of smoke, through which glared forth the flashes of the artillery. The French guns had found their range. Every shot told upon the old walls of the mansion, and crashing masonry, burning rafters falling, mingled with the yell of battle, added a frightful interest to the scene. At length the Nassau sharpshooters were driven back, and the French troops began to penetrate the orchard. But ere they could occupy it, the squadrons of English cavalry, under Lord Saltoun, bore down upon them and drove them back. Wheeling round, they then attempted the rear of the chateau, but being received unflinchingly, were obliged to retire. Despairing of success, the French artillery now discharged shells upon Hougoumont. The tower and chapel were soon in a blaze, and in these many wounded men met a dreadful fate. Still, though surrounded by flames and bursting shells, with the heavy shot ploughing through wall and window, the guards held their post, nor could Hougoumont be taken. "How beautifully these English fight, but they must give way!" exclaimed Napoleon to Marshal Soult. But evening came, and yet they held their ground. The men, maddened by seeing their comrades falling around them, longed ardently for the moment to advance, but Wellington felt that the crisis was not yet come. It required all his authority to restrain the troops, but he knew their powers of endurance. "Not yet, my brave fellows," said the Duke. "Be firm a little longer, and you shall have at them by and by." This homely appeal kept every man in his place in the ranks. But now the superior officers remonstrated and advised a retreat. "Will the troops stand?" demanded Wellington. "Till they perish," was the reply. "Then," added the Duke, "I will stand with them to the last man." Yet Wellington was not insensible of the critical nature of his position, and longed for night or Blucher. It was now 7, and the Prussians had been expected at 3. In less than an hour the sound of artillery was heard in the expected direction, and a staff officer brought word that the head of the Prussian column was at Planchenoit, nearly in the rear of the French reserve. Bonaparte, when told of their advance, maintained that it was Grouchy's long-expected force coming up, but when he saw them issue from the wood and perceived the Prussian colours, he turned pale, but uttered not a word. Napoleon's Imperial Guards, his veteran troops, were now advancing, covered by a tempest of shot and shells, toward the ridge behind which lay the British infantry to gain a shelter from the fire. Wellington eagerly watched the dense cloud as it approached, and when it arrived within 100 yards, advancing on horseback to the brow of the ridge, he exclaimed, "Up, Guards, and at 'em!" In a moment the men were on their feet. The French closed on them, when a tremendous volley drove the whole mass back. But the old Imperial Guard recovered, yet only to receive a second volley as deadly as the first, followed by a bold charge with the bayonet, which forced them down the slope and up the opposite bank. In vain the French attempted to support them by taking the Guards in flank. Lord Hill brought forward the extreme right of the army in the form of a crescent, which overlapping the horsemen, they were crushed as in a serpent's folds, while the infantry fell back, reformed, and occupied their former place on the ridge. Wellington's quick eye already detected the confusion caused by the Prussian attack under General Bülow on the French rear. Hastily closing his telescope, he exclaimed, "The hour is come. Now every man must advance." Forming into one long line, 4 men deep, the whole infantry advanced with a loud cheer, the sun at the instant streaming out as if to shed his last glories on the conquerors of that dreadful day. Headed by the Duke, with his hat in hand, the line advanced with spirit and rapidity, while the horse artillery opened a fire of canister shot on the confused masses. For a few minutes they stood their ground gallantly, and, even when the Allied cavalry charged full upon them, 4 battalions of the Old Guard formed squares and checked its advance. As the grape shot tore through the ranks of the veterans, they closed up again, and, to every summons to surrender, gave the stern reply, "The Guard never surrender. They die." Napoleon had already fled. Finding all hope of victory gone, he at first threw himself into one of the squares of the Old Guard, determined to die with them. But when the Prussians gained on their rear, and he was in danger of being made prisoner, he exclaimed, "For the present it is finished. Let us save ourselves." And, turning his horse's head, he fled with 10 or 12 of his immediate attendants. It was now 9:30 at night, and the moon rose with more than ordinary splendour. The French, now a mass of fugitives, were closely pursued by both armies, and a fearful slaughter ensued between Waterloo and Genappe. At the latter place the British discontinued the pursuit, but the Prussians, comparatively fresh, pursued without intermission, their light horse putting no limit to their revenge. Many of the poor fugitives sought shelter in the villages on their route, but at the sound of a Prussian trumpet they fled again, only to be overtaken and cut down. Wellington recrossed the field of Waterloo to sup at Brussels. The moonlight revealed all the horrors of the scene. His stern nature gave way, and, bursting into tears, he exclaimed, "I have never fought such a battle, and I hope never to fight such another." He never did. Waterloo was his last battle, though he lived for nearly 40 years afterward, a leader in English politics, and died in 1852, a national hero, a worthy twin figure to the immortal Nelson. End of section 11. Section 12. Of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Jennifer Painter. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Lord Horatio Nelson, 1758 to 1805. Horatio Nelson was born at Burnham Thorpe in Norfolk, September the 29th, 1758. His father, the rector of that parish, was burdened with a numerous family, and it is said to have been more with a view to lighten that burden than from predilection for the service that at the age of 12 he expressed a wish to go to sea, under the care of his uncle, Captain Suckling. Of his early adventures it is unnecessary to speak in detail. In 1773 he served in Captain Phipps's voyage of discovery in the northern polar seas. His next station was the East Indies, from which, at the end of 18 months, he was compelled to return by a very severe and dangerous illness. In April 1777 he passed his examination, and was immediately commissioned as second lieutenant of the Lowestoft frigate, then fitting out for Jamaica. Fortunate in conciliating the goodwill and esteem of those with whom he served, he passed rapidly through the lower ranks of his profession, and was made post-captain with the command of the Hinchinbrook of 28 guns, June the 11th, 1779, when not yet of age. In 1782 he was appointed to the Albemarle, 28, and in 1784 to the Boreas, 28, in which he served for 3 years in the West Indies, and though in time of peace, gave signal proof of his resolution and strict sense of duty, by being the first to insist on the exclusion of the Americans from direct trade with the British colonies, agreeably to the terms of the Navigation Act. He had no small difficulties to contend with, for the planters and the colonial authorities were united against him, and even the admiral on the station coincided with their views, and gave orders that the Americans should be allowed free access to the islands. Still Nelson persevered. Transmitting a respectful remonstrance to the admiral, he seized 4 of the American ships, and after a long and tedious process at law, in which he incurred much anxiety and expense, he succeeded in procuring their condemnation by the Admiralty Court. Neither his services in this matter, nor his efforts to expose and remedy the peculations and dishonesty of the government agents in almost all matters connected with naval affairs in the West Indies, were duly acknowledged by the government at home, and in moments of spleen, when suffering under inconveniences which a conscientious discharge of his duty had brought on him, he talked of quitting the service of an ungrateful country. In March 1787 he married Mrs. Nisbet, a West Indian lady, and in the same year returned to England. He continued unemployed till January 1793, when, on the breaking out of the French wars, he was appointed to the Agamemnon, 64, and ordered to serve in the Mediterranean under the command of Lord Hood. An ample field for action was now open to him. Lord Hood, who had known him in the West Indies and appreciated his merits, employed him to cooperate with Paoli in delivering Corsica from its subjection to France, and most laboriously and ably did he perform the duty entrusted to him. The siege and capture of Bastia was entirely owing to his efforts, and at the siege of Calvi, during which he lost an eye, and throughout the train of successes which brought about the temporary annexation of Corsica to the British crown, his services and those of the brave crew of the Agamemnon were conspicuous. In 1795, Nelson was selected to co-operate with the Austrian and Sardinian troops in opposing the progress of the French in the north of Italy. The incapacity, if not dishonesty, and the bad success of those with whom he had to act rendered this service irksome and inglorious, and his mortification was heightened when orders were sent out to withdraw the fleet from the Mediterranean and evacuate Corsica and Elba. These reverses, however, were the prelude to a day of glory. On February the 13th, 1797, the British fleet, commanded by Sir John Jervis, fell in with the Spanish fleet off Cape St. Vincent. In the battle which ensued, Nelson, who had been raised to the rank of Commodore and removed to the captain, 74, bore a most distinguished part. Apprehensive lest the enemy might be enabled to escape without fighting, he did not hesitate to disobey signals, and executed a manoeuvre which brought the captain into close action at once with 3 first-rates, an 80 and 2 74 gunships. Captain Trowbridge, in the Culloden, immediately came to his support, and they maintained the contest for near an hour against this immense disparity of force. 1 first-rate and 1 74 dropped astern, disabled, but the Culloden was also crippled, and the captain was fired on by 5 ships of the line at once, when Captain Collingwood, in the Excellent, came up and engaged the huge Santissima Trinidad of 136 guns. By this time the captain's rigging was all shot away, and she lay unmanageable abreast of the 80-gun ship, the San Nicolas. Nelson seized the opportunity to board, and was himself among the first to enter the Spanish ship. She struck after a short struggle, and, sending for fresh men, he led the way from his prize to board the San Joseph of 112 guns, exclaiming, "Westminster Abbey, or victory!" The ships immediately surrendered. Nelson received the most lively and public thanks for his services from the Admiral, who was raised to the peerage by the title of Earl St. Vincent. Nelson received the Order of the Bath. He had already been made Rear Admiral before tidings of the battle reached England. During the spring, Sir Horatio Nelson commanded the inner squadron employed in the blockade of Cadiz. He was afterward dispatched on an expedition against Teneriffe, which was defeated with considerable loss to the assailants. The admiral himself lost his right arm, and was obliged to return to England, where he languished more than 4 months before the cure of his wound was completed. His services were rewarded by a pension of £1,000. On this occasion, he was required by official forms to present a memorial of the services in which he had been engaged, and as our brief account can convey no notion of the constant activity of his early life, we quote the abstract of this paper given by Mr. Southey. It stated that he had been in 4 actions with the fleets of the enemy, and in 3 actions with boats employed in cutting out of harbour, in destroying vessels, and in taking 3 towns. He had served on shore with the army 4 months, and commanded the batteries at the sieges of Bastia and Calvi. He had assisted at the capture of 7 sail of the line, 6 frigates, 4 corvettes, and 11 privateers, taken and destroyed near 50 sail of merchant vessels, and actually been engaged against the enemy upward of 120 times, in which service he had lost his right eye and right arm, and had been severely wounded and bruised in his body. Early in 1798, Nelson went out in the vanguard to rejoin Lord St. Vincent off Cadiz. He was immediately dispatched with a squadron into the Mediterranean to watch an armament known to be fitting out at Toulon, the destination of which excited much anxiety. It sailed May the 20th, attacked and took Malta, and then proceeded, as Nelson supposed, to Egypt. Strengthened by a powerful reinforcement, he made all sail for Alexandria, but there no enemy had been seen or heard of. He returned in haste along the north coast of the Mediterranean to Sicily, refreshed the fleet, and again sailed to the eastward. On nearing Alexandria the second time, August the 1st, he had the pleasure of seeing the object of his toilsome cruise moored in Aboukir Bay, in line of battle. It appeared afterward that the two fleets must have crossed each other on the night of June the 22nd. The French fleet consisted of 13 ships of the line and 4 frigates, the British of the same number of ships of the line and 1 50-gun ship. In number of guns and men the French had a decided superiority. It was evening before the British fleet came up. The battle began at 6:30, night closed in at 7, and the struggle was continued through the darkness, a magnificent and awful spectacle to thousands who watched the engagement with eager anxiety. Victory was not long doubtful. The first 2 ships of the French line were dismasted in a quarter of an hour. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th were taken by 8:30. About 10, the L'Orient, Admiral Brueys' flagship, blew up. By daybreak, the 2 rear ships, which had not been engaged, cut their cables and stood out to sea, in company with 2 frigates, leaving 9 ships of the line in the hands of the British, who were too much crippled to engage in pursuit. 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates were burnt or sunk. 3 out of the 4 ships which escaped were subsequently taken, and thus, of the whole armament, only a single frigate returned to France. This victory, the most complete and most important then known in naval warfare, raised Nelson to the summit of glory, and presents and honours were showered on him from all quarters. The gratitude of his country was expressed, inadequately in comparison with the rewards bestowed on others for less important services, by raising him to the peerage by the title of Baron Nelson of the Nile, with a pension of £2,000. The court of Naples, to which the battle of Aboukir was as reprieve from destruction, testified a due sense of its obligation by bestowing on him the dukedom and domain of Bronte in Sicily. The autumn of 1798, the whole of 1799, and part of 1800, Nelson spent in the Mediterranean, employed in the recovery of Malta, in protecting Sicily, and in co-operating to expel the French from the Neapolitan continental dominions. In 1800, various causes of discontent led him to solicit leave to return to England, where he was received with the enthusiasm due to his services. Soon afterward he separated himself formally from Lady Nelson. In March 1801 he sailed as second in command of the expedition against Copenhagen, led by Sir Hyde Parker. The dilatoriousness with which it was conducted increased the difficulties of this enterprise, and might have caused it to fail, had not Nelson's energy and talent been at hand to overcome the obstacles occasioned by this delay. The attack was entrusted to him by Sir Hyde Parker, and executed April 2nd, with his usual promptitude and success. After a fierce engagement, with great slaughter on both sides, the greater part of the Danish line of defence was captured or silenced. Nelson then sent a flag of truce on shore, and an armistice was concluded. He bore honourable testimony to the gallantry of his opponents. "The French," he said, "fought bravely, but they could not have supported for 1 hour the fight which the Danes had supported for 4. May the 5th, Sir Hyde Parker was recalled and Nelson appointed commander-in-chief, but no further hostilities occurred, and suffering greatly from the climate, he almost immediately returned home. For this battle he was raised to the rank of Viscount. At this time, much alarm prevailed with respect to the meditated invasion of England, and the command of the coast from Orford Ness to Beachy Head was offered to him, and accepted. But he thought the alarm idle. He felt the service to be irksome, and gladly retired from it at the Peace of Amiens. When war was renewed in 1803, he took the command of the Mediterranean fleet. For more than a year he kept his station off Toulon, eagerly watching for the French fleet. In January 1805 it put to sea, and escaped the observation of his lookout ships. He made for Egypt, and failing to meet with them, returned to Malta, where he found information that they had been dispersed in a gale and forced to put back to Toulon. Villeneuve put to sea again, March the 31st, formed a junction with the Spanish fleet in Cadiz, and sailed for the West Indies. Thither Nelson followed him, after considerable delay for want of information and from contrary winds, but the enemy still eluded his pursuit, and he was obliged to retrace his anxious course to Europe without the longed-for meeting, and with no other satisfaction than that of having frustrated by his diligence their designs on the English colonies. June the 20th, 1805, he landed at Gibraltar, that being the first time that he had set foot ashore since June the 16th, 1803. After cruising in search of the enemy till the middle of August, he was ordered to Portsmouth, where he learned that an indecisive action had taken place between the combined fleets returning from the West Indies and the British under Sir Robert Calder. Nelson at Trafalgar. He had not been many days established at home before certain news arrived that the French and Spanish fleets had entered Cadiz. Eager to gain the reward of his long watchings and laborious pursuit, he again offered his services, which were gladly accepted. He embarked at Portsmouth, September the 14th, 1805, on board the Victory, to take the command of the fleet lying off Cadiz under Admiral Collingwood, his early friend and companion in the race of fame. The last battle in which Nelson was engaged was fought off Cape Trafalgar, October the 21st, 1805. The enemy were superior in number of ships, and still more in size and weight of metal. Nelson bore down on them in two lines, heading one himself, while Collingwood, in the Royal Sovereign, led the other, which first entered into action. "See!" cried Nelson, as the Royal Sovereign cut through the centre of the enemy's line, and muzzle to muzzle engaged a three-decker. "See how that noble fellow Collingwood carries his ships into action." Collingwood, on the other hand, said to his captain, "Rotherham, what would Nelson give to be here?" As the Victory approached, an incessant raking fire was directed against her, by which 50 of her men were killed and wounded before a single gun was returned. Nelson steered for his old opponent at Cape St. Vincent, the Santissima Trinidad, distinguished by her size, and opened his fire at 4 minutes after 12, engaging the Redoubtable with his starboard, the Santissima Trinidad and Bucentaur with his larboard guns. About 1:15, a musket ball, fired from the mizzen top of the Redoubtable, struck him on the left shoulder, and he fell. From the first he felt the wound to be mortal. He suffered intense pain, yet still preserved the liveliest interest in the fate of the action, and the joy visible in his countenance as often as the hurrahs of the crew announced that an enemy had struck, testified how near his heart, even in the agonies of death, was the accomplishment of the great work to which his life had been devoted. He lived to know that his victory was complete and glorious, and expired tranquilly at 4:30. His last words were, "Thank God, I have done my duty." He had indeed done his duty and completed his task, for thenceforth no hostile fleet presumed to contest the dominion of the sea. It may seem mournful that he did not survive to enjoy the thanks and honours with which a grateful country would have rejoiced to recompense this crowning triumph. But he had reached the pinnacle of fame, and his death in the hour of victory has tended far more than a few years of peaceful life to keep alive his memory in the hearts of a people which loved and a navy which adored him. End of section 12.
Section 13 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Israel Putnam, 1718 to 1790. Israel Putnam, the redoubtable hero of Indian and French adventure in the old colonial wars, the survivor of many a revolutionary fight, was born at Salem, Massachusetts, January 7, 1718. His grandfather, from the south of England, was one of the first settlers of the place. The boy was brought up with his father on the farm. He had little education in literature, much in the development of a hardy, vigorous constitution in his contest with the soil and the actual world about him. He was fond of athletic exercises and adept in running and wrestling, in which he proved himself more than a match for his village companions. The story is told of his being insulted for his rusticity on his first visit to Boston by a youth of twice his size, when he taught the citizen better manners by a sound flogging. Before he was of age, he was married to the daughter of John Pope of Salem, and presently removed with his wife to a farm in the town of Pomfret in eastern Connecticut. His rugged powers were no doubt sufficiently taxed in the ordinary labors of the field. In those days the farmer had enemies to encounter, which have since vanished from the land. The well-known fable of Aesop, of the boy and the wolf, had then a literal application. Every child in the days of our fathers knew the story of Putnam, and the she-wolf which he dragged from its den. This and similar tales go far to make up the popular reputation of the hero, and it was as a man of the people that Putnam first appears upon the public scene. Upon the breaking out of the Old French War, as it was termed, at the age of 37, he drew together a band of his neighbors and reported himself with the Connecticut contingent before Crown Point. He appears to have been employed in this service under Major Rogers, the celebrated partisan ranger whose life he is said to have saved in an encounter with a stalwart Frenchman. Putnam conducted himself as a man of resources and valor in this mixed species of warfare, in achieving a reputation which brought him, in 1757, the commission of Major from the Connecticut legislature. It was the year of the memorable massacre at Fort William Henry. Putnam was with the forces whose headquarters were at the neighboring Fort Edward, under the command of General Webb, and made several vigorous attempts to assist in the support of the beleaguered fortress. But his efforts were not seconded by the commander, who ungenerously left the fort a prey to Montcalm and the Indians. These adventures of Putnam displayed his personal courage in approaching the enemy on Lake George, and subsequently in command of his rangers in rescuing a party of his fellow soldiers from an Indian ambuscade at Fort Edward. The year 1758 saw Major Putnam again in the field, under the command of Abercrombie, at the scene of his former labors in the vicinity of Lake George. In the early movements of the campaign, Putnam distinguished himself in an ambuscade by a destructive night attack upon a party of the enemy at Wood Creek. When the main line advanced towards Ticonderoga, he was with the lamented Lord Howe in the front of the center, when that much-loved officer was slain upon the march. It was the first meeting after the landing from Lake George with the advance of the French troops. There was some skirmishing which attracted the attention of the officers. Putnam advanced to the spot, accompanied, contrary to his dissuasions, by Lord Howe, who fell at the first fire. The party of Putnam, enraged by this disaster, fought with gallantry and inflicted a heavy loss upon their opponents. The result of this miserably conducted expedition, however, made no amends for the loss of the gallant Howe. 2,000 men were blunderingly sacrificed before Ticonderoga, and the threatened siege was abandoned. The life of Putnam is full of perilous encounters incident to border service against the Indians. In one of these, he narrowly avoided capture by the savages on the Hudson, near Fort Miller. He escaped only by shooting the rapids with his boat, a marvelous adventure which is said to have wakened a superstitious veneration for him in the minds of his Indian assailants. Not long afterwards, however, the barbarians had an opportunity of treating him with less respect. It was in the month of August of this year that he was engaged with a reconnoitering party in company with the partisan Rogers near Ticonderoga. They had been employed in watching the movements of the enemy and were on their return to Fort Edward when the attention of the French partisan officer Molang, who was on lookout, was attracted to them by a careless shooting match between Rogers and a fellow British officer. A confused hand-to-hand action ensued in the woods, in the course of which Putnam, his gun missing fire, while the muzzle was pressed against the breast of a large and well-proportioned savage, was captured and bound to a tree by that formidable personage. The English party, now rallying, drove their pursuers backwards, which brought the unfortunate Putnam to a central position between two fires. Human imagination, well, says Colonel Humphreys, can hardly figure to itself a more deplorable situation. Putnam remained more than an hour deprived of all power save that of hearing and vision, as the musket balls whizzed by his ears with a ruthless savage aiming his tomahawk repeatedly with the infernal dexterity of a Chinese juggler within a hair's breadth of his person. This amusement was succeeded by the attempt of a French petty officer to put an end to his life by discharging his musket against his breast. It happily misfired. The action was now brought to an end in favor of the provincials, but Putnam was carried off in a retreat by his Indian captor. He was now destined to witness one of those scenes, since so well described by Cooper, of the peculiar tortures inflicted by the Indians upon their prisoners of war, but unhappily with less complacent feelings than the reader of the skillful novelist experiences, whose terrors are tempted by the delightful art of the narrator. With Putnam, the spectator and the sufferer were the same. He has been bound on the march with intolerable thongs. He has almost perished under his burdens. He has been tomahawked in the face. He now is to be roasted alive. A dark forest is selected for the sacrifice. Stripped naked, he is bound to a tree, and the inflammable brushwood piled around him. Savage voices sound his death knell. Fire is applied, when a sudden shower dampens the flame to burst forth again with renewed strength. Though securely fastened, the limbs of the victim are left some liberty to shrink from the accursed heat. He has thought his last thought of home, of wife, and children. When the desperate French partisan Molang, the commander of the savage hordes, hearing of the act, rushes upon the scene and rescues him from his tormentors. Putnam is now restored to the guardianship of the Indian chief by whom he had been captured, and from whom he was separated during these hours of agony, when he had fallen into the hands of the baser fellows of the tribe. The party now reached Ticonderoga, where Putnam is delivered to Montcalm, and thence courteously conducted by a French officer to Montreal. There he found himself within reach of a benevolent American officer, then a prisoner in the city, Colonel Peter Schuyler, who generously ministered to his necessities, and who was instrumental in procuring his release from the French commander when he himself was exchanged after the capture of Frontenac. Putnam, on his return home, gallantly conducted through the wilderness the sorely tried Mrs. Howe and her children, whose adventures in Indian captivity and among the French equal the inventive pages of romance. The next year, in Amherst's great campaign, Putnam returned to Montreal under better auspices. He was with that commander in his onward movement, with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and rendered efficient service in the passage down the St. Lawrence by his bravery and ingenuity. When the fort of Oswegatchie was attacked, and 2 armed vessels were in the way, he proposed to silence the latter by driving wedges to hinder the movement of their rudders, and to cross the abatis of the fortification by an attack from boats, armed with long planks, which were to be let down when the vessels, protected by the fascines, were placed alongside of the work. A timely surrender anticipated both of these expedients. The dying Wolfe had conquered Canada at Quebec, making victory easy elsewhere in the province. Montreal surrendered to the Allied forces without a blow. Putnam, it is recorded, availed himself of the opportunity to look up the Indian chief who had taken him prisoner and exchange civilities and hospitalities now that the tables were turned. We next find Putnam in charge of a Connecticut regiment in a novel field of warfare on the coast of Cuba in Lord Albemarle's attack upon Havana in 1762. He was in considerable danger in a storm when the transport in which he embarked with his men was wrecked upon a reef of the island. A landing was effected by rafts and a fortified camp established on the shore. He was again fortunate in escaping the dangers of a climate so fatal to his countrymen. On his return home, he was engaged in service against the Indians with the title of colonel. The war being now over, he retired to his farm, which he continued to cultivate till he was again called to the field by the stirring summons of Lexington. In the preliminary scenes of the war, he fairly represented the feelings of the mass of his countrymen, as it was excited by the successive acts of parliamentary aggression. As a soldier of the old French War, he had learned the weakness of British officers in America, and the strength of hardy, patriotic peasantry. If, he said, it required 6 years for the combined forces of England and her colonies to conquer such a feeble colony as Canada, it would, at least, take a very long time for England alone to overcome her own widely extended colonies, which were much stronger. Another anecdote is characteristic of the blunt farmer. Being once asked whether he did not seriously believe that a well-appointed British army of 5,000 veterans could march through the whole continent of America, he replied, "No doubt, if they behaved civilly and paid well for everything they wanted, but if they should attempt it in a hostile manner, though the American men were out of question, the women, with their ladles and broomsticks, would knock them all on the head before they had got halfway through." The news of Lexington, the war message, transmitted from hand to hand till village repeated it to village, the sea to the backwoods, found the farmer Pomfret 2 days after the conflict, like Cincinnatus, literally at the plow. He unyoked his team and hastened in his rude dress to the camp. Summoning the forces of Connecticut, he was placed at their head, with the rank of Major General, and stood ready at Cambridge for the bloody day of Bunker's Hill. He was in service in May in the spirited affair checking the British supplies from Noodles Island in Boston Harbor, and resolutely counseled the occupation of the heights of Charleston. When the company of Prescott went forth on the night of June 16th to their gallant work, he was with them, taking no active command, but assisting where opportunity served. He was seen in different parts of the field, but his chief exertions appear to have been expended upon the attempted fortification of Bunker's Hill, where he met the fugitives in the retreat and conducted such of them as would obey him, says Bancroft, to the Knights' encampment at Prospect Hill. Putnam's was one of the first congressional appointments, 10 days before the battle, when the rank of Major General was conferred upon him. He continued to serve at the siege of Boston, and when the theater of operations was changed by the departure of the British to New York, was placed by Washington in 1776 in command in that city until his own arrival. He employed himself during this short period with several devices for the safety of the harbor. In August, on the landing of Howe, he was, upon the sudden illness of Greene, who had directed the fortifications, and after the arrival of the British, left in command at the Battle of Long Island, and much censure has been thrown upon him for the neglect of the passes by which the American left was turned. In the actual combat, there appears to have been a divided authority. The abandonment of New York next followed, with the retreat to Westchester and the passage through the Jerseys. Putnam was then, in January 1777, ordered to Philadelphia to make provision for its defense. In May, he was put in command of the post at the Highlands to secure its defenses and observe, from that central position, the movements of the enemy. In the summer of this year, Sir Henry Clinton, at New York, sent up the river a flag of truce to claim one Edmund Palmer, who had been taken in the American camp as a lieutenant in the British service. This drew forth from Putnam a reply which has been often quoted. Headquarters, August 7th, 1777. Edmund Palmer, an officer in the enemy service, was taken as a spy lurking within our lines. He has been tried as a spy, condemned as a spy, and shall be executed as a spy, and the flag is ordered to depart immediately. Israel Putnam. P.S. He has been accordingly executed. In September, a portion of Putnam's command was withdrawn by Washington for the support of the army in Pennsylvania by a peremptory order which, it is said, put an end to a plan formed by Putnam for a separate attack on the enemy at New York. Forts Montgomery and Clinton, at the entrance to the Highlands, fell into the hands of Clinton by a surprise shortly after, but the conquest of this important position was neutralized by the victory of Gates at Saratoga. The British remained at Fort Montgomery but 20 days. Putnam seems still to have entertained some project in connection with New York, which led him to withhold troops called for by the imperious necessities of Washington. The neglect of these orders brought a pointed letter from Hamilton and an equally sufficient rebuke from Washington himself. In the following spring, Putnam was relieved of his command in the Highlands by the appointment of General McDougall to the post and was ordered to Connecticut to superintend the raising of the new levies. He was stationed the following winter at Danbury, when the famous descent of the precipice at Horseneck occurred, one of the latest marvels of Putnam's anecdotal career. While he was on a visit to one of his outposts at Horseneck, Governor Tyrone of New York advanced upon the place with a considerable body of troops. Putnam planted his small force on a hill, but was speedily compelled to provide for the safety of his men by a retreat, and for his own by plunging down a formidable rocky steep by the roadside. In 1779, he was again in the Highlands, superintending the defenses then erected at West Point, one of which, the fort now in ruins, bore his name. In the winter, he visited his family in Connecticut, and as he was returning to the army at Morristown, was struck with paralysis. His right side was enfeebled, and his active career ceased, though he enjoyed the cheerful, tranquil pursuits of age. His memory remained unimpaired. One of his amusements was to relate to his friend and military companion, Colonel Humphreys, those events of his varied life, which that officer wrought into the pleasing narrative appropriately addressed to the State Society of the Cincinnati in Connecticut, and published by their order. The dedication of the work to Colonel Jeremiah Wadsworth bears date June 4th, 1788, about 2 years before the decease of the hero of the story. General Putnam died at Brookline, Connecticut, May 29th, 1790, in his 73rd year. End of Section 13. Section 14 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Anthony Wayne, by O.C. Bosbyshell, 1745-1796. Across the pages of history recording mighty conflicts that rock nations and governments to their foundation, flash certain grand characters whose career adds a charm to the dreary and often prosaic narrative. Some bright particular star whose luster flings romance over dry facts, firing the hearts of all patriots with enthusiasm and national fervor. Honoring the great commanders of the wars of the ages for their noble deeds, here and there sparkles out the brilliant genius of a warrior with less responsibility, but whose name inspires the ardor of men, the love of women, and the fervor of the poet and novelist. Such a character, such a man, was Mad Anthony Wayne, an able, fearless soldier of the American Revolution. So thoroughly patriotic, such an earnest, honest believer in the righteous cause for which he fought, that he was mad indeed with all found arrayed against the interests of the colonists, or with those who, having donned the Continental uniform, were indisposed to fight. Anthony Wayne was born in Waynesboro, Easttown Township, Chester County, Pennsylvania, on January 1st, 1745. He sprang from good English stock. His grandfather resided in Yorkshire, England, but during the reign of Charles II purchased an estate in the county Wicklow, Ireland, and settled on it. Being a thorough Protestant, he espoused the cause of King William III, and in the service of that monarch fought in the Battle of the Boyne as a captain of dragoons. In 1722, he came to America with his 4 sons and procured some 1,600 acres of land in Chester County, Pennsylvania, upon which he settled in 1724. His youngest son, Isaac, the father of Anthony Wayne, received as his share of his father's estate 500 acres of land near Paoli. Born and brought up amid the charming surroundings of this most beautiful country, it is easily understood why Anthony Wayne became so thoroughly imbued with the tastes for the beautiful. His neatness in dress and earnest advocacy of a brilliant uniform for officers and men of the Revolutionary Army had its foundation in the very atmosphere he lived in, this magnificent Chester Valley. Dandy Wayne, indeed, but only so far as neatness in dress and delicacy of taste were concerned, for a nobler-minded, more unselfish patriot never entered the army of a nation. Wayne was educated at the Philadelphia Academy, and he became a surveyor of some note. He attended closely, however, to his magnificent farm and took a lively interest in all affairs affecting his fellow citizens. In 1765 and 66, only just of age, he was sent to Nova Scotia to survey some lands belonging to Benjamin Franklin and others. In May 1766, he married Mary, the daughter of Bartholomew Penrose, a Philadelphia merchant, and settled down to the life of a farmer. He was a stirring man in his neighborhood, fond of an active and outdoor life. He was filled with military impulses. His choice of profession, that of surveyor, evidently arose from his taste for exploration and for the excitement incident to plunging into trackless wastes of forest and mapping out new boundaries. His love of military pursuits led him to study all the great works on the art of war, and when the time came he was prepared, as few soldiers of the Revolution were, for the conflict against the trained soldiers of Great Britain. He formed companies with the men in his neighborhood and drilled them assiduously. This gave him prominence and popularity, so that he is found a member of the Pennsylvania legislature in 1774 through 75. Wayne seemed to have prescience of what was coming, and when the conflict came, he was ready. In September 1775, he raised a regiment of soldiers, of which he became the colonel in January the following, and joined General Sullivan's command in Canada in the spring of 1776. At the Battle of Three Rivers, May 1776, Wayne displayed remarkable military knowledge and was enabled to extricate his command from difficulties that seemed almost insurmountable. In a letter to Dr. Franklin and others, he gives a graphic description of his engagement. Of his men engaged, he says, "I have lost more than 1/4 part, together with a slight touch in my right leg, which is partly well already." This was Wayne's first battle. He displayed such remarkable coolness and excellent judgment throughout his engagement as to command the respect and admiration of all the army. His entire career during this unfortunate Canadian campaign exhibited clearly his soldierly qualifications. Recognizing these, General Schuyler in November 1776 appointed Colonel Wayne to the command of Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence, for which military post Wayne considered the second most important in the country. While stationed there, Wayne busied his men in rendering the place as nearly impregnable as possible, and by warm, fervid letters implored the powers that be in Pennsylvania to send proper clothing, food, and arms to the men of that state serving in his army. So negligent did the state seem to the needs of its men that this warm-hearted, high-spirited warrior seriously thought of resigning his commission, being unable to longer witness the impoverished condition of his troops. Colonel Wayne was appointed brigadier general in February 1777 and ordered to join General Washington's army at Morristown, New Jersey, in April of the same year. He was given command of the Pennsylvania line, consisting of 2 brigades of 4 regiments each, with a total strength of about 1,700 men. His activity and alertness during the summer in harassing and annoying the enemy went far toward ridding the state of that enemy and gaining for him the praise of Washington, who publicly acknowledged his bravery and good conduct. The British, unable to force their way through New Jersey, determined to go around by sea to Philadelphia, and after embarking at Staten Island, were next heard from within the Chesapeake Bay. Washington moved his army to Wilmington, Wayne having been sent ahead to organize the militia rendezvousing in Chester County, Pennsylvania. He rejoined the army at Germantown and marched with it to Wilmington. In the Battle of Brandywine, September 11, 1777, Wayne was particularly distinguished. He occupied the left of the American line at Chad's Ford and had opposed to his forces the Hessians, commanded by Baron von Knyphausen. He fought all day, holding his ground tenaciously, repelling every effort made by the enemy to cross the ford and worrying them by repeated attacks of his light infantry, which he frequently sent over the creek for the purpose. The right wing of the enemy having been turned, Wayne at sunset retreated in good order without the loss of any artillery or stores. On the evening of September 20th, Wayne, with a detachment of 1,200 men, was suddenly and impetuously attacked at Paoli Tavern by a very large force of the rear guard of the British Army, which rear guard he had been sent to annoy. By the betrayal of Tory spies at the time of the attack, the forces were not more than 10 yards distant. Notwithstanding the impetuosity of the attack, by largely overwhelming numbers, Wayne succeeded in extricating his command without loss of artillery, ammunition, or stores. Some 61 Americans were killed. A court of inquiry was instituted to inquire into Wayne's conduct of this affair, which resulted so distastefully to him that he demanded a court-martial. This court-martial acquitted him with highest honors, a conclusion approved by General Washington. Wayne's residence was searched by the British immediately after the Paoli fight, with the hope of capturing the general. The officer, in his zeal, ripped open a feather bed with his sword. Mrs. Wayne indignantly exclaimed, "Do you expect to find General Wayne in a feather bed? Look where the fight is the thickest." Wayne led the right wing at the Battle of Germantown, October 4th, 1777, and forced the enemy back a distance of 2 miles. The British claim that this was the first time we had ever retreated from the Americans. The balance of the army, failing to accomplish the end desired, Wayne was compelled to retreat, but this he did in good order, and when General Howe, who could not persuade himself that we had run from victory, as Wayne puts it, followed the Americans, Wayne drew up in line. When he advanced near, we gave him a few cannon shot with some musketry, which caused him to break and run with the utmost confusion. Wayne lost a horse in this engagement and received slight wounds in the hand and foot. The memorable winter at Valley Forge followed. General Wayne, ever active, devoted his time to procuring necessary supplies for the army. His earnest appeals to the state authorities and men of influence for the welfare of the brave men at Valley Forge tell a tale of suffering and endurance hard to realize. Early in the spring of 1778, he successfully raided the British lines, carrying off horses, cattle, forage, and other supplies. After the evacuation of Philadelphia, Wayne kept up a constant annoyance around the rear of the British Army, fighting whenever the opportunity came. The American Army re-entered New Jersey in June 1778 and moved across that state in a line parallel with the route taken by the British Army. These lines encountered one another on June 28th at Monmouth, an engagement fought in the main on the plan suggested to General Washington by General Wayne. General Charles Lee's half-hearted action, to call it no more severe name, resulted in the Battle of Monmouth being less of a disaster to the British Army than it promised. Wayne did his part gloriously. Lee, who with his own command was in full retreat when he should have earnestly supported Wayne, ordered Wayne to retire. This the latter did, chagrined and mortified, until the mortification was turned into delight upon meeting the commander-in-chief, who immediately ordered Wayne to advance to the attack again. This is just what Wayne wanted, and with 3 Pennsylvania regiments, 1 from Maryland and 1 from Virginia, he stayed the assaults of the flower of the English army, the corps d'élite, and successfully held his line, causing the enemy to retire with great loss. General Washington commended General Wayne in the highest terms for his good conduct and bravery through the whole action. Writing of this engagement to the Secretary of War, Wayne says, "Tell the Phila-ladies that the heavenly, sweet, pretty redcoats, the accomplished gentlemen of the guard, and grenadiers have humbled themselves on the plains of Monmouth." The enemy retreated to New York and remained in that city the balance of the year. Wayne occupied the time in urging active operations and trying to infuse a more aggressive spirit into the management of affairs. At this time, public affairs were very much hampered by a feeling of indifference as well as an elusive notion that peace would soon follow. This affected the nation and the army. Wayne baffled these false ideas with all his powers. He urged the government to forward needed supplies of clothing and food. He could not be inactive, fervid, earnest, and aggressive. He must be ever doing. The American Army kept a close watch on the movements of the British in New York during the summer and fall of 1779. General Washington organized a light infantry corps and put General Wayne in command. It was considered one of the finest bodies of troops attached to the Continental Army, and was composed, besides the choicest sons of Pennsylvania, with 2 Connecticut and 1 Virginia regiment. The commander-in-chief was extremely desirous of driving the British from the forts commanding King's Ferry on the Hudson, at Stony Point on the western bank of the river, and at Verplancks Point, directly opposite. This dangerous business was confided to Wayne and his light infantry corps, the plan of operations being carefully prepared by General Washington. This plan was followed by Wayne, except one particular, which change Washington declared to be an improvement on his own plan. Wayne, after the most careful preparations, moved to the assault on Stony Point, a fortification strongly built on a rocky eminence 150 feet above the Hudson River, at 12 o'clock at night on July 16, 1779. Wayne's report to Washington tells the story of the fight most graphically. He says he gave the troops the most pointed orders not to attempt to fire, but to put their whole dependence on the bayonet, which was mostly faithful and literally observed. Neither the deep morass, the formidable and double rows of abatis, or the high and strong works in front and flank could damp the ardor of the troops, who, in the face of a most tremendous and incessant fire of musketry, and from artillery loaded with shells and grape shot, forced their way at the point of bayonet through every obstacle, both columns meeting in the center of the enemy's works nearly at the same instant. Before entering the fort, Wayne was struck in the head by a musket ball. He fell stunned, but soon rallied, and, by the assistance of 2 of his aides, was helped into the fortification and shared the capture with his troops. The Stony Point achievement roused the patriotic spirit of the Americans. It was deemed the most brilliant affair of the war. Congratulations from the commander-in-chief and all the prominent generals, as well as the foremost citizens and assemblies, were heaped upon Wayne, and Congress voted him a gold medal to commemorate his gallant conduct, besides thanking him for his brave, prudent, and soldier-like conduct in the well-conducted attack on Stony Point. After the treachery of Arnold in 1780, the charge of the fort at West Point was committed to General Wayne. He marched his division over the mountain in a dark night, a distance of 16 miles, in 4 hours, without a single halt or a man left behind. In January 1781, owing to the broken promises of Congress, a large number of men in the Pennsylvania line mutinied, an event that threatened serious consequences to the American army. This defection was suppressed peaceably, mainly through the excellent tact of General Wayne. He was idolized by his soldiers, who knew him as the soul of honor and who placed implicit trust in his statements. Washington, in a letter, certifies to his great share in preventing worse extremities and thanks him for his exertions. In February 1781, Wayne was ordered to join General Greene's army, then operating in South Carolina, but upon Lord Cornwallis's rapidly transferring his forces to Virginia, this order was changed, and Wayne was directed to reinforce Lafayette. This he did at Fredericksburg in June. The enemy seemed intent upon destroying all military stores they could reach, and for this purpose continually sent raiding parties through the state. The efforts of Wayne were ever put forth to suppress these raids. Believing on July 6, 1781, that Cornwallis's forces were divided by the James River, Wayne was sent forward to attack them at Green Springs. He found a great force of the British army in his front. Too late to retreat, Wayne, with true soldierly instinct, having faith in the courage and discipline of his men, boldly charged a force 5 times as large as his own, threw them into disorder, and safely brought his men away under the cover of the enemy's confusion. Cornwallis hastened to Yorktown, the investiture and siege of which Wayne aided in furthering, first by occupying the ground south of the James River to prevent the enemies reaching North Carolina, and then in opening the first parallel with 6 regiments on October 6, 1781. A few days afterward, he, with 2 battalions, covered the Pennsylvania and Maryland troops while they began the second parallel. Wayne, with the Pennsylvania regiments, supported the French troops in the attack of the 14th and was present at the surrender on the 19th. Notwithstanding a wound in the fleshy part of his leg, early in the siege, caused by a sentry mistaking him, Wayne remained active and participated in the glory of the capture of Cornwallis and his army. This operation over, Wayne joined the army of General Nathanael Greene in South Carolina in January 1782 and was instrumental in quelling the disturbances in that section. A very large force of Indians threatened the destruction of his command on the night of June 23, 1782. These Indians were skillfully handled by a noted Creek chief as well as by a British officer. They surrounded Wayne's forces and held his artillery. Wayne fiercely attacked, using only the bayonet, and so impetuous was his onslaught that he broke the lines of the Indians and routed them completely. The dead body of the Creek leader, who it is said was felled by Wayne's own sword, was found on the ground the next day. Wayne commanded the forces that took possession of Savannah and Charleston after their evacuation by the British. Having freed the South from all marauders, Wayne returned, much shattered in health from the effect of a low fever, to his old home in Pennsylvania and settled down to civil life, desiring, as he puts it, to pass many happy hours in domestic felicity with a few of our friends, unfettered by any public employ and consequently unenvied. He was, however, made a member of the Council of Censors, and in 1784 represented his county in the General Assembly of Pennsylvania. He was likewise, in 1787, a member of the Convention of the State called to ratify the Constitution of the United States. To better look after an estate given him by the state of Georgia in recognition of the services he rendered that state, Wayne settled there and was elected a member of Congress on January 3, 1791. He served from October 1791 to March 1792, when, a contest being made, Congress decided his election illegal and declared his seat vacant. Almost immediately after this action, On April 3, 1792, President Washington appointed Wayne Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army with the rank of Major General, an appointment confirmed by the Senate on the same day. No more single act could have marked the approval of Wayne's great services to the nation in the War of the Revolution than this great mark of approbation conferred by his illustrious chief. To him was entrusted the settlement of the difficulties then existing with the Indians in the Northwestern Territory. These savages, stirred up by the British, armed with British guns and often led by British officers, continued the warfare on the Americans after peace had been declared between the contending countries. Efforts to subjugate them under Generals Harmar and St. Clair had failed. General Wayne, whose entire life clearly shows a man prepared for what may come, wisely drilled the force he collected to undertake this work for a year. He knew the value of a well-drilled and disciplined army. Having perfected his troops, he, by easy stages, advanced into the disturbed territory, establishing posts at various points, which he cleverly fortified, and upon every occasion and opportunity offered the savages peace. These offers were as often rejected. From Fort Defiance, a fort he built and named at the junction of the Miami and Laglaise rivers, he, in August 1794, went down the Miami River with about 1,000 men until he came close to a British post at the foot of the rapids of the river. Here he sent a last overture to the Indians, promising peace if they would lay down their arms. Upon their rejecting this, he, on August 20th, moved to the head of the rapids and attacked them with such vigor, using again his favorite weapon, the bayonet, that their defeat was overwhelming. The entire surrounding country was laid waste. The army advanced to the junction of the St. Joseph and St. Mary's rivers, where a strong fort was built and named Fort Wayne. The present flourishing city of that name in Indiana now stands upon this spot. The winter was spent in Greenville, at which place the Indians, on August 3, 1795, against the wishes of their leaders and English allies, signed a treaty of peace in which 12 tribes took part, a peace which was never broken and by which an immense territory was ceded to the United States and opened up for settlement. Wayne returned early in 1796 on a short visit to Pennsylvania, and everywhere en route received the plaudits of his fellow citizens. His reputation in Philadelphia was exceedingly brilliant. The unsettled condition of affairs in the Northwest, however, made his stay brief. Having been appointed sole commissioner to treat with the disaffected parties there and directed to take possession of all forts held by the British in that country, he returned in June of the same year. With great tact, he performed wisely and well the difficult mission entrusted to him. In November, he left Detroit to visit the last of the posts included in his orders. This was then called Presque Isle, but is now the site of the city of Erie. When within a short sail of this post, a severe and sudden attack of the gout came on. He was carried into the blockhouse at Presque Isle in a dying condition and lingered in great agony until December 15, 1796, when he died. By his own desire, he was buried at the foot of the flagstaff on a high hill called Garrison Hill, north of the present Soldiers' Home. In 1809, his son, Colonel Isaac Wayne, removed the body to the family burying ground at St. David's Church, Radnor, Pennsylvania, where, on July 4th of the same year, the Society of Cincinnati erected a monument in his honor. So lived, so died Anthony Wayne, gentleman, soldier, statesman, patriot, mad, dandy, blacksnake, tornado, angry with traitors, neat, courageous, irresistible. None can study his life without feeling the nobleness of his character. Courtly in manners, honorable to a degree, high in aspirations, unselfishly for country, magnanimous in victory, loyal to authority, affectionate to family, pure in morality, and earnest for the right. Anthony Wayne's life is a bright example and legacy to the American youth of all times. End of section 14. Section 15 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Frances Marion, 1732 to 1795. Frances Marion, the partisan general of South Carolina, was of Huguenot descent, the first American settlers of the same name being Benjamin Marion and Judith Blanet, his wife, who came from France in 1690 and established themselves in a plantation on one of the tributaries of the Cooper River near Charleston. Gabriel, the son of Benjamin, married Esther Cords. These were the parents of Frances Marion. He was born, it would appear, in St. John's Parish, Berkeley County, probably in 1732. His early life was passed till his 27th year in agricultural pursuits, when we first hear of him in connection with military matters in the period of the Old French War. He took the field with Moultrie and fought gallantly by the side of that officer in the Cherokee country against the savages at the Battle of Ocoee. He then returned to his farm near Eutaw Springs, ripening for the work of the Revolution, which found him at the height of manhood, at the age of 43. The people of his district relied upon his understanding, for we find them sending him as their delegate to the Provincial Congress of 1775, when he was appointed captain in the regiment of his former superior officer, Colonel Moultrie. His first duty was to gather a company, which he speedily effected in the eastern region, where he was well known. He was then employed in the neighborhood of Charleston, being engaged in the occupation of Fort Johnson and the command of Dorchester. He was with Moultrie at Sullivan's Island in May 1776, during that fierce day of battle when the British were driven from the southern colonies, and particularly distinguished himself in the gallant defense. At the ill-managed attack upon Savannah by the combined forces of D'Estaing and Lincoln, which ended so disastrously for the Americans, Marion was present with his regiment, which did much by its gallantry to redeem the honor, if not the fortunes, of the day. Next came, in the winter of 1780, the siege of Charleston by Sir Henry Clinton. It was evident from the beginning that the city must fall, and it has been a point much discussed whether Lincoln should have attempted to defend it, whether it would not have been better for the cause that he should withdraw his troops and besiege the British from the open country. This was what afterward took place when the conquerors were reduced almost to starvation. An accident which happened to Marion has been esteemed a piece of singular good fortune to the cause, in saving him from surrender. He was in command of the small body of light troops outside the city when he was called to aid in the defense. During the first days of the very deliberate investment, he was dining with some friends in the town when, according to a custom not unusual in those hard drinking times, the door was locked, that no one should avoid his share of the conviviality. Determined to escape the infliction, he threw himself from the window into the street. The fall fractured his ankle and incapacitated him from service. In obedience to an order of Lincoln, commanding all officers unfit for duty to retire from the city, he left while the country was still open and took refuge in his native region of St. John. His freedom was thus preserved for the service of his country. Now came the incursions of Tarleton and the devastating warfare of Cornwallis, a policy of savage extermination which would have driven a people with less capability of exertion to despair. But it happened, as it has before, that the very means employed to crush excited the spirit of resistance, and deliverers were raised up for the oppressed. It was a peculiar species of warfare which was now entered upon, requiring novel resources both for attack and defense. A thinly inhabited country was the scene of operations, cut up in all directions by rivers and their branches and innumerable swamps. Large bodies of troops could move only with difficulty. It was a service for small parties of cavalry always in movement, making up by rapidity for want of numbers. On the side of the British, Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton, an officer of spirit whose fiery youth has been vividly handed down to us in the portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds, was the leading representative of this method of warfare, harrying the land with his mounted troops and overcoming by his activity and unscrupulousness. Success added terror to his name as he gained victory after victory and seemed destined to sweep the land of its patriot defenders. He was the right arm of Cornwallis in his movements in the interior and began to be deemed invincible when his course was arrested by Morgan, the Virginian, and his resolute companies of native defenders of the state at the Battle of Cowpens. But it was in Marion that the chief spirit of resistance was incorporated. On the arrival of Gates from the north, in command of the Southern Army, having partially recovered from his lameness, he presented himself before the hero of Saratoga on his march toward the fatal field of Camden. American commanders were accustomed to odd sights of dress and equipment in the patriot soldiery who enlisted under their banners, and Gates must have been used to appearances with which the eye of Washington himself was but too familiar. The little band of Marion, however, seems to have astonished even their American brethren in arms. As for the well-equipped British, they always held the ragged American regiments in contempt till they were soundly flogged by them. An intelligent looker-on at the camp, Colonel Otho Williams, in his narrative of the campaign, speaks of Colonel Marion's arrival, quote, attended by a very few followers, distinguished by small leather caps and the wretchedness of their attire. Their number did not exceed 20 men and boys, some white, some black, and all mounted, but most of them miserably equipped. Their appearance was, in fact, so burlesque that it was with much difficulty the diversion of the regular soldiery was restrained by the officers, and the general himself was glad of an opportunity of detaching Colonel Marion, at his own instance, toward the interior of South Carolina, with orders to watch the motions of the enemy and furnish intelligence. End quote. It was while Marion was engaged on this service that the Battle of Camden was fought, but luckily he had no share in the misadventure. He was employed, in fact, in quite an independent career of his own, organizing his own forces and acting at his own discretion. He was at the head of that system of partisan warfare which, in its developments, was to rid the state of the foreign foe. His present command, Marion's brigade, was formed from the hardy-spirited population of Irish descent settled between the Santee and the Pedee in the territory of Williamsburg. They were convinced of the intentions of the British rulers at Charleston to reduce them to political servitude. They knew their rights and, knowing, dared to maintain them. Their movement was voluntary, as they gathered their small but resolute force of picked men and called Marion to its command. He had already assumed it and caused the Tories to feel his new authority when the defeat of Gates took place. It roused him at once to a new effort to redeem the fortunes of war. He was already in the neighborhood of the field, and hearing that a British guard was on its way with a considerable body of prisoners, he determined to arrest the party on its march. 2 days after the battle, he concerted an attack and, with the loss of but one man, killed and took 22 regulars and 2 Tories prisoners, and retook 150 Continentals of the Maryland line. He was now a recognized leader in the field, and the British commander-in-chief directed his efforts to his overthrow. "I most sincerely hope," wrote Cornwallis to Tarleton, "that you will get at Mr. Marion." But Mr. Marion was not so easily to be caught. on the appearance of a superior force under the command of Tarleton, which it would have been vain to resist, the skillful partisan turned his forces in another direction, to the borders of North Carolina, where he overawed the Scotch Tories in that disaffected region. The ruthless conduct of the British whom he had left behind now raised the South Carolinians to fresh resistance, when Marion, ever mindful of his opportunity, returned to the state with speed, accomplishing 60 miles in one day, and in a bold night attack defeated a large body of Tories on the Black Mingo. Following this up with some smaller success of the kind, he again attracted the attention of Tarleton, who issued out of Charleston in force for his capture, and when he was fairly on his heels, wearied out and perplexed by the windings of his foe, gave up the chase, it is said, with the exclamation, "Come, my boys, let us go back. We will soon find the gamecock," Marion's brother partisan, Sumter. But as for this damned swamp fox, the devil himself could not catch him. The tide was now turning as the people felt their strength. Kings Mountain, in the autumn of this memorable 1780, brought a vast accession of the strength to the popular cause, in the proof that the best British troops were not invincible before an aroused yeomanry. But there was much yet to be done before the day of final deliverance was secured. It was a slow, weary, harassing policy which was to be pursued, of surprises and escapes, of self-denial and endurance, of the watchful, unyielding virtue of Marion and his men. They took post in an island fortress of a wooded swampland at the junction of the Pedee and Lynch's Creek, known as the Camp of Marion, where he recruited his forces, husbanded his strength, and sallied forth on his raids against the foe. This is the spot where the popular admiration of Marion finds its home and center. His career as a partisan, says his faithful biographer, the novelist Sims, in the thickets and swamps of Carolina is abundantly distinguished by the picturesque. But it was while he held his camp at Snow's Island that it received its highest colors of romance. In this snug and impenetrable fortress, he reminds us very much of the ancient feudal baron of France and Germany, who, perched on a castle eminence, looked down with the complacency of an eagle from his eyrie, and marked all below him for his own. The resemblance is good in all respects but one. The plea and justification of Marion are complete. His warfare was legitimate. It is in this place the scene is laid of an interview with the British officer so familiar to the public in popular narratives and pictorial illustration. A flag from the enemy at the neighboring post of Georgetown is received with the design of an exchange of prisoners. The officer is admitted blindfold into the encampment, and on the bandage being taken from his eyes, is surprised equally at the diminutive size of the general and the simplicity of his quarters. He had expected, it is said, to see some formidable personage of the sons of Anak, of the standard military figure, which, as Mr. Sims remarks, averaged in the opposing generals during the war more than 200 pounds. On the contrary, he saw a swarthy, smoke-dried little man with scarcely enough of threadbare homespun to cover his nakedness, and instead of tall ranks of gay-dressed soldiers, a handful of sunburnt, yellow-legged militiamen, some roasting potatoes and some asleep, with their black firelocks and powder horns lying by them on the logs. This is Weem's narrative, a little colored with his full brush, but true enough as to detail. The improvement which he works up from the plain potato presented as a dinner to the officer is equally sound as a moral, though we will not vouch for the exact expression of the sentiment. As a specimen of Weems, it is characteristic, but certainly Marion never talked in the fashion of this zealous biographer. The Briton, however, entrenched at Charleston and with his double lines of forts encompassing the interior, was not all at once driven out. When he was compelled to leave, it was by the slow process of an exhaustion to which even victory contributed, for every British conquest in that region was as costly as a defeat. Greene came with his Fabian policy, acquired in the school of Washington, to repair the errors of Gates. It was a course with which the policy of Marion was quite in agreement, attacking the enemy when they were vulnerable, at other moments retreating before them. Both officers knew well how to drain the vitality of the British army. Greene appreciated Marion. "I like your plan," he wrote to him, "of frequently shifting your ground. We must endeavor to keep up a partisan war." He sent Lieutenant Colonel Lee to his aid, and together they attempted the capture of Georgetown in a night attack, which was but partially successful, in consequence of a loss of time and the want of artillery. Though not fully carried out, it served as a diversion and alarm in the rear of Cornwallis, who now, after the defeat of an important portion of his force under Tarleton, was advancing rapidly through North Carolina at the heels of Greene. Lee was recalled to join his commander, and Marion continued his partisan warfare in South Carolina. He was after a while reinforced by Greene on his return to the state, and assisted that general greatly in the movements which resulted in imprisoning the enemy in Charleston. After a brilliant affair with the British, in conjunction with Lee and Sumter and other bold spirits, he hastened to Greene in time for the Battle of Utah, in which engagement he commanded the right of the South Carolina militia and gallantly sustained the fierce attack of the enemy. Toward the close of the war, he took his seat in the Legislative Assembly, which met at Jacksonboro, as the representative of St. John, Berkeley. He was engaged in one or two further conflicts with the enemy, and the struggle which he had so manfully sustained was at an end. He now retired to his plantation to find it broken up by the incursions of the British. While engaged in its restoration, he was sent as representative of the district to the Senate of the state. It is recorded to his credit that he displayed in this situation a regular magnanimity toward Tory offenders in preserving their lands from confiscation. "It was war then," he said. "It is peace now. God has given us the victory. Let us show our gratitude to heaven, which we shall not do by cruelty to man." In the same lofty spirit, he refused to receive any advantages from a bill exempting the soldiers of the militia from prosecution for acts committed in the service. He felt that his conduct needed no shelter. The legislature rewarded him with thanks and the more substantial appointment of Commandant of the Port of Charleston, a nominal office with a salary of £500, which were cut down to dollars. A timely marriage, however, with a wealthy lady of Huguenot descent, Miss Mary Vidot, a spinster of 50, who was attracted by the hero, relieved him of pecuniary anxieties, leaving him an old age of ease in agricultural pursuits. He still represented his parish in the state senate and sat in 1790 in the convention for forming the Constitution. In 1794, he resigned his military commission given to him by Rutledge, and the following year, yielding to a gradual decline, expired on February 27th at the age of 63. Marion was a true, unflinching patriot, a man of deeds and not of words, a prudent, sagacious soldier, not sudden or quick in quarrel, but resolute to the end, a good disciplinarian and beloved by his men who came at his call. There was no power of coercion such as restrains the hired soldier in his little band. It was held together only by the cohesive force of patriotism and attachment to the leader. We hear of no acts of cruelty to stain the glory of his victories, but much of his magnanimity. End of Section 15.
Section 16 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Mason Lewis. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Paul Jones. 1747 to 1792. Paul Jones, the popular naval hero of the Revolution, the son of John Paul, a gardener in Scotland, was born July 6, 1747, at a cottage on the estate of his father's employer, Mr. Craik, at Arbigland, in the parish of Kirkbean. His parents belonged to a respectable class of the population of the country. The boy, as is wont with Scottish boys, however humble, received the elements of education, but could not have advanced very far with his books, since we find him, at the age of 12, apprenticed to the sea. The situation of Kirkbean, on the shore of the Solway, naturally gave a youth of spirit an inclination to life on the ocean, and he had not far to seek for employment in the trading port of Whitehaven, in the opposite county of Cumberland. Paul's first adventure, the appendix of Jones was an afterthought of his career, was in the service of Mr. Younger, a merchant in the American trade, who sent his apprentice on a voyage to Virginia, where an elder brother of Paul had profitably established himself at Fredericksburg. This gave him an early introduction to the country with which the fame of the future soldier of fortune was to be especially identified. The apprenticeship of Paul was of short duration. The failure of his employer threw the youth upon his own resources, but he lost no time in taking care of himself. His studies on shipboard had already qualified him for the higher duties of the mercantile service. The slave trade, the active pursuit of those days, offered him an engagement. He sailed for the African coast in the King George, a vessel engaged in this infamous traffic, out of Whitehaven, and in his 19th year was trusted as chief mate of the Two Friends, another vessel of the trade, belonging to Jamaica. Having carried his human cargo to the island, sickening of the pursuit, he sailed as a passenger to Kirkcudbright, in his native district. Opportunities are always presenting themselves to the watchful and the initiated. The chief officers of the vessel died of the fever. Paul took command and carried the ship in safety to the owners. They put him in command of the brig, the John, on another West India voyage. Finally, in 1771, he left Scotland never to return to it, save to carry terror among its population. He proceeded to London, found employment in the West India trade, and in 1773 settled himself for a while in Virginia on the estate of his brother, to whom he had now become heir. This was a grand turning point of his career, and to signalize it properly, Paul, who was somewhat of a fanciful turn, added the name Jones to his proper appellation, John Paul. On the organization of the Infant Navy of the United States in 1775, John Paul Jones, as he is henceforth to be called, received the appointment of first of the first lieutenants in the service, in which, in his station on the flagship Alfred, he claimed the honor of being the foremost, on the approach of the Commander-in-Chief, Commodore Hopkins, to raise the new American flag. This was the old device of a rattlesnake coiled on a yellow ground, with the motto, "Don't tread on me," which is yet partially retained in the seal of the War Office. The first service of the new squadron was the attack upon the island of New Providence, in which Jones rendered signal assistance. On the return voyage, the unsatisfactory encounter with the Glasgow occurred, which afterward resulted in the dismissal of one of the American officers, and Jones's appointment in his place to the command of the Providence, of 12 guns and 70 men. His exploits in this vessel gained him his first laurels. He now received the rank of captain, and sailed on various expeditions, transporting troops, conveying merchantmen, outsailing British frigates, and greatly harassing the enemy's commercial interests. His success in these enterprises induced Commodore Hopkins to put him in command of the Alfred and other vessels on an expedition to the eastward, which resulted in the capture of various important prizes of transport and other ships, and extensive injury to the fisheries at Canso. On his return, he was superseded in the command of the Alfred, his seniority in the service being set aside, a grievance which led to remonstrance on his part, and a correspondence with the Committee of Congress, in the course of which Jones made many valuable suggestions as to the service, and gained the friendship of that eminent businessman of the old Confederacy, Robert Mortis. There appear to have been several appointments for him in progress, when his somewhat unsettled position became determined by the resolve of Congress to send him to France for the purpose of taking command of a frigate to be provided for him by the commissioners at Paris. By the resolution of June 14, 1777, he was appointed to the Ranger, newly built at Portsmouth, and, a second instance of the kind, had the honor of hoisting for the first time the new flag of the Stars and Stripes. He claimed the distinction, for the bristling vanity of Jones made him punctilious in these accidental matters of personal renown. It took some time to prepare the Ranger for sea, but Jones got off on his adventure in November, made a couple of prizes by the way, and at the end of the month reached Nantes. Disappointed in obtaining the large vessel which he expected, and obliged to be contented with the Ranger, he employed his time in making acquaintance with the French navy at Quiberon Bay, and offering valuable suggestions for the employment of D'Estaing's fleet on the American coast. He soon determined to put to sea on an adventure of spirit. On April 10th, 1778, he sailed from Brest on a cruise in British waters. Directing his course to the haunts of his youth, he captured a brigantine off Cape Clear and a London ship in the Irish Channel, planned various bold adventures on the Irish coast, which he was not able to carry out from adverse influences of wind and tide, but well nigh succeeded in burning a large fleet of merchantmen in the docks of Whitehaven. In this last adventure he made a landing at night, and advanced to the capture of the town batteries, leaving his officers to fire the ships, of which there were about 200 in the port. His orders were not obeyed, either from insufficient preparations or the relenting of his agents, when he himself set fire to one of the largest vessels. It was now day, and the people were warned by a deserter from his force, but Jones managed to hold the whole town at bay till he made good his retreat. This daring affair was an impromptu of Jones's genius, justified in his view by similar depredations of the British on the American coast, but it had an ugly look of ingratitude to the place which had sheltered his youth, and first given him promotion in the world. Nor was this all. He immediately crossed to his native shore of Scotland, with the intention of seizing the Earl of Selkirk at his seat on the promontory of St. Mary's Isle, on the Solway, near Kirkcudbright. Landing at the spot, he ascertained that the Earl was from home. Disappointed in his object, he would have returned, when the officers in his boat insisted upon a demand for the family plate. Jones demurred, but yielded with the proviso that the thing was to be done in the most delicate manner possible. His lieutenant, Simpson, undertook the business, and introduced himself to Lady Selkirk, who was, conveniently enough for his purposes, engaged at breakfast. She had at first taken the party for a press gang, and had offered them refreshments. On being informed of the nature of their visit, their request, backed by the armed crew at the door, was complied with. It is said that Jones apologized personally to Lady Selkirk, and we shall presently find him, at the interval of leisure, taking measures to repair the act. For the moment, however, he had more serious work on hand. In his voyage along the Irish coast, he had looked into Belfast Lough, after His Majesty's sloop of war Drake, of 20 guns, which he attempted to board in a night attack by a bold maneuver, which came within an ace of success. Immediately after the affair of St. Mary's, he ran across the Channel, and had the fortune to meet the Drake coming out of Carrickfergus. She was getting to sea to check the exploits of the Ranger, which had now alarmed the whole region. Jones desired nothing more than an encounter. As the ship drew up, she hailed the Ranger. Jones gave the reply through his sailing master. "The American continental ship Ranger. We are waiting for you. Come on. The sun is a little more than an hour high, and it is time to begin." A broadside engagement commenced, and it continued at close quarters for an hour, when the Drake surrendered. Her captain and first lieutenant were mortally wounded, her sails and rigging terribly cut up, and the whole much shattered. The loss of the Ranger was 2 killed and 6 wounded. That of the Drake, 42. The Drake had 2 guns the advantage of her adversary. Action took place on April 24th. On May 8th, Jones, having traversed the Channel, carried his prize safely into Brest. His first thought now was to make some amends to Lady Selkirk and his own reputation for the plundering visit of his lieutenant. He therefore addressed to her, the very day of his landing, an extraordinary letter. Jones was very fond of letter writing, full of high-sounding phrases and professions of gallantry and esteem, in the midst of which he failed not to recite the splendid victory of the Ranger. He drew a picture of the terrors inflicted by the British in America, and in respect to that unfortunate plate, expressed his intention to purchase it, in the sale of the prize, and restore it at his own expense to the family. This, after delays and obstacles, he finally accomplished some years later, when we are told it was all returned as it was taken, the very tea-leaves of the parting breakfast clinging to the teapot. The affair of the Ranger, so brilliantly conducted, the short energetic cruise in narrow seas, so near the British naval stations, gave Jones a great reputation for gallantry in Paris. The delays and difficulties, however, incidental to the wretched state of the American finances abroad, and the imperfect relation of his country with the French court, were well calculated to cool any enthusiasm excited by his conquest. A man of less vivacity and perseverance than Jones might have dropped the service. He persevered. His lieutenant, Simpson, after various refractory proceedings, had sailed home in the Ranger, when an arrangement was finally made with le Roi de Chaumont, the negotiator of the French court, to furnish a jointly equipped and officered fleet, of which Jones was to take command. 5 vessels were thus provided, including the American frigate Alliance. An old Indiaman, the Duke de Duras, fell to the lot of Jones. In compliment to Dr. Franklin, one of the commissioners, and especially in gratitude for a hint which he had accidentally lighted upon in an odd number of that philosopher's almanac, to the effect that whoever would have his business well done must do it himself, a suggestion by which Jones had greatly profited. In giving a final spur to his protracted negotiations, he changed the name of his vessel, by permission of the French government, to the Bonhomme Richard. Jones at length set sail on August 14th with his squadron. Landais, an incompetent Frenchman in the American service, was in command of the Alliance. It was altogether a weak, mongrel affair. The Bonhomme Richard was unseaworthy, her armament was defective, and in her motley crew Englishmen and foreigners outnumbered the Americans. The plan of the cruise was to sail round the British Islands from the westward. At Cape Clear the commander parted with 2 of the smaller vessels of the squadron, which now consisted of his own ship, the Alliance, the Pallas, and the Vengeance. The service was, however, far more impaired by the insubordination of Landais, who evinced great jealousy of his superior. Several prizes were taken, one of them by Jones off Cape Wrath at the extremity of Scotland. Traversing the eastern coast, he arrived with the Pallas and the Vengeance at the Firth of Forth, and entertained the bold idea of attacking the armed vessels at the station, and putting not only Leith, but possibly the capital Edinburgh itself, under contribution. He would certainly have made the attempt. Indeed, it was in full progress, when it was defeated by a violent gale of wind. Jones now continued his course southwardly, casting longing eyes upon Hull and Newcastle, when, having been joined by the Alliance, the squadron suddenly, off Flamborough Head, fell in with the Baltic cruisers, Serapis, 44, Captain Pearson and the Countess of Scarborough, 20. Captain Piercy convoying a fleet of merchantmen. Jones at once prepared for action. The combat which ensued between the Serapis and the Bonhomme Richard is one of the most remarkable in the annals of naval warfare, for the circumstances under which it was fought, the persistence of the contest, and the well-matched valor of the commanders. The engagement was by moonlight on a tranquil sea, within sight of the shore, which was crowded with spectators, who thronged the promontory of Flamborough Head and the piers of Scarborough. After various preliminary maneuvers on the part of the English commander to shelter the merchantmen, the engagement began at 7:30 in the evening, with a series of attempts of the Bonhomme Richard to come to close quarters with her antagonist. The first broadside of Jones's vessel, 2 of the old 18-pounders mounted in her gunroom burst with fearful destruction to the men. This accident compelled the closing of the lower ports, and produced a still greater inequality between the combatants than at the start. For the Serapis was not only a well-constructed, well-furnished man-of-war, thoroughly equipped, while the Bonhomme Richard had even disadvantage in these respects. But the absolute weight of metal was, at the outset, greatly in favor of the Englishmen. The Richard then passed to windward of the Serapis, receiving her fire, which did much damage to the rotten hull of the old Indiaman. Jones next attempted a movement to get into position to rake his antagonist from stern to stern, which resulted in a momentary collision. There was an effort to board the Serapis, which was repulsed, when Captain Pearson called out, "Has your ship struck?" Jones instantly replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." The ships then separating, were brought again to a broadside encounter, when Jones, feeling the superior force of the Serapis, and her better sailing, was fully prepared to take advantage of the next position, as the ships fell foul of one another, to grapple with his opponent. He himself assisted in lashing the jibstay of the Serapis to the mizzenmast of the Richard. The ships became now closely entangled for their full length on their starboard sides. So near were they together that the guns of one touched the sides of the other, and in some places, where the portholes met, the guns were loaded by passing the rammers into the opposite vessel. Every discharge in this position was, of course, most deadly, and told fearfully upon the rotten hull of the Richard. To add to Jones's embarrassment, he was repeatedly fired upon by Landais from the Alliance, which always kept her position with the Richard between her and the enemy. This extraordinary circumstance is only to be accounted for by an entire lack of presence of mind in the confusion, or by absolute treachery. The Serapis poured in her fire below from a full battery, while the Richard was confined to 3 guns on her deck. She had efficient aid, however, in clearing the deck of the Serapis from the musketry and hand grenades of her men in the tops. One of these missiles reached the lower gun deck of the Serapis, and there, setting fire to a quantity of exposed cartridges, produced a destruction of life, an offset to the fearful loss of the Richard by the bursting of her guns in the opening of the engagement. The injury to the Richard, from the wounds inflicted upon her hull, was, at this time, so great that she was pronounced to be sinking, and there was a cry among the men of surrender. Not, however, from Jones, who was as much himself at this extremity as ever. Seeing the English prisoners who had been released below, more than 100 in number, rushing upon deck, where in a moment they might have leaped into the Serapis and put themselves under then country's flag, he coolly set them to working the pumps to save the sinking ship. Human courage and resolution have seldom been more severely tried than in the exigencies of this terrible night on board the Richard. Jones continued to ply his feeble cannonade from the deck, leveled at the mainmast of the adversary. Both vessels were on fire, when, at 10:30, the Serapis struck. The loss in this extraordinary engagement, which outstrips and exaggerates the usual vicissitudes of naval service, was, of course, fearful. The entire loss of the Richard is estimated by Cooper at 150, nearly 1/2 of all the men she had engaged. Captain Pearson reported at least 117 casualties. The Bonhomme Richard was so riddled by the enemy's fire and disemboweled by the gunroom explosion that she could not be saved from sinking. When the wind freshened the day after the victory, she became no longer tenable. Her living freight was taken from her, and Jones, in the forenoon of the 25th, with inexpressible grief, saw her final plunge into the depths of the ocean. While the engagement of the Richard and Serapis was going on, the Pallas, better officered than the Alliance, captured the other English vessel, the Countess of Scarborough. The 2 prizes were carried to the Texel, where the squadron enjoyed the uneasy protection of Holland. Himself had a more satisfactory reception in an enthusiastic greeting on the exchange at Amsterdam, and a brilliant triumph, illuminated by the smiles of the fair sex, shortly after in Paris. In October 1780 he left for America in the Ariel, bearing with him a gift from the king, a gold-mounted sword, with the inscription on the blade, Vindicati Maris Ludovicus XVI Renumerator Strenuo Vindici, Louis XVI rewarder to the valiant defender of a liberated sea. The voyage was interrupted at its outset by a severe storm off the harbor, in which Jones displayed his usual heroism. The vessel was refitted, and after a particular action on the high seas with a mysterious stranger, reached Philadelphia in February 1781. In 1787 he left America with the intention of serving under Louis. When he reached Paris, he was met by a proposition to enter the service of Catherine of Russia, in which he was induced to engage by prospects of rank and glory. On his journey to St. Petersburg he had a characteristic adventure in his passage from Stockholm to Revel, which he made while the navigation was interrupted by ice, traversing the sea with great hardihood in an open boat, extorting the labors of the boatmen by his threats of violence. He was well received by the Empress, who forwarded him to Potemkin, then in command on the Black Sea in a war with the Turks. It is not necessary to recount the movements of a small squadron, with a divided command and jealous councils, presided over by a whimsical, despotic court favorite. Many as were the vexations encountered by Jones in the inefficient resources, the shifts and expeditions of foreign allies, and the straits of the American commissioners, were light compared with the stifling restraints of Russian tyranny. Jones did much fighting in his command of the Wolodomor on the Black Sea against the Pasha, but retired with little glory. Persecution followed at St. Petersburg. There was an assault upon his moral character, which was triumphantly disproved. Various projects flitted through his teeming mind. Connection with the country closed after a residence of 15 months. It is sad to watch the last years of Paul Jones, not indeed of age, but of growing weariness and disease, as he renews his broken Russian hopes, and revives the old, faded, pecuniary claims on the French court. A gleam of sunshine appears in his aspirations to serve his country, for he still looked across the Atlantic, in the removal of the chains from the American sailors imprisoned at Algiers. His country listened to his cry, but he was charged to treat with the Regency for their ransom. But before the commission reached him, he had passed to that land where the weary cease from sighing and prisoners are at rest. Here, with mercy bending over the scene, let the curtain fall. Paul Jones died at Paris at the age of 45, of a dropsical affection, July 18, 1792. The person of Paul Jones is well known by the numerous prints devoted to his brilliant exploits. You will see him, a little active man of medium height, not robust, but vigorous, a keen black eye, lighting a dark, weather-beaten visage, compact and determined, with a certain melancholy grace. He was one of nature's self-made men. That is, nature gave the genius and he supplied the industry, for he knew how to labor, and must have often exerted himself to secure the attainments which he possessed. He was a good seaman, as well as a most gallant officer, sagacious in the application of means, vain indeed and expensive, but natural and generous, something of a poet in verse, much more in the quickness and vivacity of his imagination, which led him to plan nobly. Accomplished writer, and as he was found worthy of the warm and unchanging friendship of Franklin, that sage who sought for excellence, while he looked with a kindly eye upon human infirmity, we too may pursue the virtues of the man and smile upon his frailties. End of section 16.
Section 17 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Section 17, Tecumseh, by James A. Green. It would be a difficult matter for a well-read American to recall the names of more than 4 or 5 notable Indians, leaving, of course, contemporaneous red men out of the question. The list might comprise Pocahontas, best known probably for something she did not do, Powhatan, that vague and shadowy Virginian chief, King Philip, who had a war named after him and so succeeded in having his name embalmed in history, Pontiac, whose great conspiracy Parkman has made immortal, and Tecumseh. But of them all, Tecumseh is easily foremost. He was a man who, had he been born to great position among civilized nations, would have stamped his name and fame upon the world. He was not a mere savage of the ordinary type, bloodthirsty, brutal beyond description, going upon one aimless raid after another to glut his passion for rapine and murder. These savage traits were not his, though all the good qualities of the Indian he possessed in double measure. He was fearless, he was untiring, and when once started toward an end, he knew no rest until he had accomplished his design. He had a primitive dignity of thought and expression that marked him as a great orator. At the famous council at Vincennes, when Tecumseh had finished his speech and was about to sit down with his braves, the interpreter, pointing to General W. H. Harrison, said, "Your father wishes you to take a chair." But the ordinary courtesy of calling the white governor the father of the red men was repugnant to Tecumseh, and with lofty mien and unpremeditated eloquence he declined the proffered seat. "No," he exclaimed, "the sun is my father, the earth is my mother, and I will rest on her bosom." And he sat down on Mother Earth with his assembled warriors, this act and fiery speech more than ever binding them to his fortunes. Tecumseh was in reality the first of the great Ohio men. He was a Shawnee Indian, and his tribe in the middle of the 18th century had emigrated from Florida to what is now the state of Ohio, Tecumseh being born in what is now Clark County, near the present city of Springfield, in an Indian town that bore the name of Piqua. This must not be confounded with the present Ohio town of Piqua, which is in another county altogether, the birthplace of Tecumseh now being the site of a straggling village bearing the name West Boston. In his boyhood there was nothing unusual. He grew up in the stirring times when Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, and the other hardy Kentucky pioneers, Long Knives the Indians called them, were leading their forces into the West. It was a time when the Indians were constantly fighting. They did not live in Kentucky, but they regarded the fertile woods and prairies south of the Ohio River as their hunting grounds, and they attacked with savage cruelty all the whites that dared to encroach upon this territory. The whites, in turn, crossed the Ohio in reprisal, burnt the Indian towns, tomahawked women and children, destroyed cornfields, and were as unrelenting and barbarous in their revenge as their savage foes. Tecumseh was born about 1776, and in 1780 the village of Piqua was attacked by a party of 1,000 Kentuckians, who, after a fierce battle, drove out the Indians and destroyed the place. It was amid such scenes that the Indian boy grew to manhood. In that wild time, war was the only science and butchery the only trade that an Indian could follow. One of the favourite Indian pursuits of the day was the capture of parties of emigrants and traders who came floating down the Ohio in canoes or broadhorns. For miles the Indians would secretly follow such a party, and then, when their opportunity came, would strike their deadly blow. When a boy of 17, Tecumseh was in a party making an attack on some boats near the present site of Maysville, Kentucky. The boats were captured and all the people in them slaughtered on the spot except one person, who was spared and later burnt alive. The horror of the spectacle so impressed Tecumseh that he and then and there said he would never again be guilty of such cruelty, and the vigorous manner in which he protested against it so moved his companions that they agreed with him to not repeat the act. This resolution Tecumseh never altered. Time and time again he protected women and children from his infuriated followers. At the Battle of Fort Meigs, a party of Americans was captured by the British and Indians. Though they had surrendered as prisoners of war, yet the savages were firing into them promiscuously, or selecting such as those to tomahawk in cold blood. This dreadful scene was interrupted by Tecumseh, who came spurring up and, springing from his horse to the ground, dashed aside 2 Indians who were about to murder an American, threatening to slay anyone who would dare to injure another prisoner. Turning to the British General Proctor, he asked why such a massacre had been permitted. "Sir," said Proctor, "your Indians cannot be commanded." "Begone," was the angry reply of the outraged Tecumseh. "You are unfit to command. Go, put on petticoats." This was only one incident of many showing how far he was above the ordinary Indian in magnanimity of character. At the already mentioned Vincennes Conference, Tecumseh agreed with General William Henry Harrison, his unrelenting foe, and who judged him as harshly as any of the frontiersmen who feared and hated him, that in case of any outbreak of hostilities, the women and children on both sides were to be protected and respected. Certain it is that General Harrison would have made no such agreement had he not believed that his adversary would keep it. Tecumseh defends the whites at Fort Meigs. To understand the life and work of Tecumseh, it is necessary to look into the history of his times. His career was embraced between the period of the Revolution and our Second War with Great Britain. The destiny of the Great West was not then assured. Ohio and Kentucky were frontier states, vastly farther from the seat of government than is the most remote of our western outposts today. They could be reached only by a toilsome journey over the Alleghenies and a trip down the Ohio. A journey today to the Yellowstone or to the regions beyond the Black Hills does not mean, in the way of time, danger, or adventure, 1/10 what a journey to Fort Washington, Cincinnati meant in 1800. Indiana was a territory, and the territorial governor, first of the Northwest and then of Indiana, was William Henry Harrison, a born fighter, a palaverer, and who, in the difficult position which he occupied in dealing with unruly settlers on the one hand and turbulent Indians on the other hand, displayed singular tact and ability. He was eminently the right man in the right place. But in spite of the claims the United States made of the West, the country was but little known, nor was its real importance even suspected. That the Mississippi Valley would one day be peopled by millions and be the greatest, wealthiest, and most productive part of the country was not thought of even by the most sanguine of Americans. The eastern states in those days had affairs enough of their own on hand, and the western frontier was not regarded as essentially important. The national idea, the nation with a big N, as recent humorous newspaper writers have put it, had not been evolved. It was difficult for even a man of the persuasive powers of General Harrison to induce the general government to furnish half enough troops to adequately guard the outposts. If there was serious work to do, the settlers had to do it themselves. There was little grumbling over this state of affairs, however, as the Kentuckians and Westerners generally had been brought up to do their own fighting and not to wait for the government at Washington to do it for them. In those days, British agents were actively at work among the northern Indians to keep them in a state of disaffection toward the United States. Meanwhile, the Indians were in the midst of the great tragedy that has been enacted since the days of Columbus. They were the victims of traders who sold them firewater, and for poor and cheap weapons demanded furs whose value was out of all proportion to that given in return. Many of their women married white renegades who corrupted the morals of the tribes. They were being dispossessed of the finest homes and best hunting grounds in America, for the buffalo was then found in Kentucky in great herds, and their position was thoroughly unhappy. They had then, and happily this is not wholly the case at present, no rights that a white man was bound to respect. But the Indians were still many, and the settlers were few. To a great leader, who of course could not take into account the mighty force behind the Anglo-Saxon ranks that first marched over the Alleghenies, it would still seem practical to band the red men together in a vast confederation and drive the invaders back again beyond the Ohio and the mountains. This was Tecumseh's splendid plan. This was the design to which he devoted his life, and which he pursued with such ardour and genius as to do what an Indian had never before accomplished. Pontiac, it is true, at the siege of Detroit, gathered a number of tribes under his leadership, but he never dreamed of a continental confederacy, as did Tecumseh. In this vast design he was materially aided by his brother, best known by the name of the Prophet, who, while lacking in judgment, was none the less a man of extraordinary force of character. He proclaimed that he had received power from the Great Spirit to confound the enemies of the Indians, stay the march of disease and death, and that he was the Messiah to lead his people to new and greater things. But as conditions to success, the Indians must stop drinking firewater. They must cease intermarrying with the whites or trading with them, and they must hold all things as the property of all. They must return to their original dress and manners and forget that they had ever seen or known the pale-faces. The fame and influence of the prophet spread with almost miraculous rapidity, and young men and warriors came from afar in crowds to receive inspiration from him. Tecumseh, with rare ability, turned this influence to advance his own plans. And of course, this constant stream of visitors to his brother enabled the chief to spread his racial idea far and wide. One of the things that Tecumseh maintained was that the Indians held their land in common, that no one tribe owned this or that territory, but that the Great Spirit had given it equally to all. This he said at the conference of Vincennes, but General Harrison ridiculed the idea and stated that if the Great Spirit had intended to make one nation of the Indians, he would not have put different languages into their heads, but would have taught them all to speak alike. Tecumseh bitterly replied that no one tribe had the right to give away what was the joint property of all, and not until the United States agreed to cease purchasing lands from the Indians and restored the lands recently bought would peace be possible. Pointing to the moon that had risen on the council, Governor Harrison said that the moon would sooner fall to earth than the United States would give up anything fairly acquired. "Then," said Tecumseh, "I suppose that you and I will have to fight it out." But these councils ended in nothing except a manly and impressive statement by Tecumseh of his position, and a strong and terribly just indictment of the whites for their treatment of the Indians. Tecumseh was constantly on the move, now on the lakes, now on the Wabash, then on the Mississippi or the plains to the westward, then on the Ohio or the hills that rolled to the south from it. everywhere the Indians received him graciously. But an accident destroyed his plans, and one defeat dashed his confederation to pieces. During his absence, Governor Harrison, alarmed at the gathering of warriors at the prophet's town of Tippecanoe on the Wabash River in Indiana, marched against it. There was no necessity for a battle. It might easily have been avoided. Toward the close of day, the Americans reached Tippecanoe. The Indians disclaimed any hostile ideas, and it was settled that the terms of peace were to be arranged the next day. That night, however, the Indians treacherously attacked the Americans. The conflict was fierce and bloody. The Indian braves were animated by the promises of the prophet, who declared that they would be victorious and that he had rendered the bullets of the white men of no avail. During the battle, he stood on a neighbouring hill and chanted a war song to further fill his warriors with courage and enthusiasm. But though the red men fought gallantly, they were doomed to defeat. They were scattered up and down the Wabash, their town was burnt, and the power of the Western Indians was, by this one blow, shattered. So complete was the victory, and so far-reaching in its effects, that General Harrison at once became the popular idol, and the glorification of the Battle of Tippecanoe a generation later carried him into the presidential chair. It was this battle that gave the West to the whites. As for Tecumseh, he returned suddenly from the West to find that despite his commands, the prophet had permitted a battle. In his rage and disappointment, he took his brother, now fallen and disgraced, by the hair and shook him. But no longer was it possible to hold his tribes together. The victory of the United States at Tippecanoe took the ardour for battle and resistance quite out of them. There were hundreds of them, however, who in the War of 1812, which broke out immediately, followed Tecumseh into the British service, in which he was commissioned as a Major General. In that service, he was doomed to continued disaster. The English commander, General Proctor, was incompetent and in all the qualities of real manhood the inferior of his savage ally. After the Battle of Put-in Bay on Lake Erie, he started to retreat. Tecumseh protested and was induced to go on only by the promise that winter supplies would be delivered a few miles up the Thames. It was on this stream that Proctor finally determined to make a stand. But at the outset of the action, he, coward-like, retreated with his redcoats, leaving the Indians to bear the brunt of the battle. Tecumseh had gone into the fight saying that he would be killed, and his prediction was verified. But how he died, no one can say with certainty. No less than 4 Americans claim the honour of having killed him. Among the slain in that time of fierce pursuit and confusion, his body was not even identified. But there it was, on the banks of that quiet Canadian stream, some 35 miles from Detroit, that the greatest Indian in statecraft, diplomacy, devotion to his people, and indignity of thought and intellectual gifts, found his unmarked grave. No one yet has written a biography of him that does full justice to his great abilities and lofty character, but his name is the most familiar of all Indian names, and he is the only Indian after whom Western fathers and mothers have ever named their sons. The late General of the United States Army, William Tecumseh Sherman, bore his name, as have hundreds of other boys born in Ohio, Kentucky, and the great states that roll westward from them. End of section 17. Read by Julie Jackson, Staffordshire, England, 1st of June 2021.
Section 18 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. James Lawrence, 1781 to 1813. Captain James Lawrence was one of that band of chivalrous spirits who, concentrating all their life in the work, with insufficient means, in the face of powerful enemies, raised our infant navy in an instant, as it were, to an honored rank in the world. The force and energy of the free national development were felt in the spontaneous movement that placed so many ardent, courageous spirits at the service of the country. These men, Barry, Barney, Decatur, Bainbridge, Perry, Somers, and the rest, the list is a long one, were volunteers in the cause, fighting more for glory than for pay. Such spirits were not to be hired. Theirs was no mercenary service. It was limited by no prudential considerations. They went forth singly or united, the commissioned champions of the nation, with their lives in their hands, ready to sacrifice themselves in that cause. Punctilious on all points of honor, they sought but one reward, victory. There was but one thing for them to do, to conquer, and, failing that, to die. Of these fiery-souled heroes who carried their country in their hearts, the men of courtesy and courage, of equal humanity and bravery, true sons of chivalry, Lawrence will ever be ranked among the noblest. He was born October 1, 1781, at Burlington, on the banks of the Delaware in New Jersey. His father, John Lawrence, was an eminent counselor at law at that place. The death of his mother, shortly after his birth, threw the change of the child upon his elder sisters, by whom he was tenderly cared for. His disposition answered to this gentle culture. The boy was dutiful and affectionate, amiable in disposition, and agreeable in manners. Such a soil is peculiarly favorable to the growth of the manly virtues, where nature has assisted by her generous physical gifts. The bravest men have often been the gentlest. It is the union of the two conditions which, as in Sir Philip Sidney, makes the perfect warrior. Young Lawrence early showed a liking for the sea, and would have led a life on the waters from the age of 12, had not his father firmly turned his attention to books and education. It was his intention to prepare him for his own profession, the law, and his desire that he should enjoy the usual preparatory finished education. This was, however, prevented by his pecuniary misfortunes, and the youth passed from his primary school at once to the law office of his brother, John Lawrence, then residing at Woodbury. He spent 2 years in this situation, between 13 and 15, or thereabout, vainly endeavoring to reconcile his humors to the onerous duties of the unwelcome position. The death of his father left him, in a measure, free to follow his own inclinations, and his brother, perceiving his strong bent for the sea, placed him under the care of a Mr. Griscom at Burlington to study navigation, evidently with a view to enter the naval service of the country, for we find him, after a brief 3 months' instruction, in possession of a midshipman's warrant. This was dated September 4, 1798, the year when Congress seriously directed its attention to the protection of our commerce, then so wantonly pillaged by the two great belligerents of Europe, by the creation of a distinct Navy Department, and the enlargement of our naval force. The movement was specially directed to the French aggressions on the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. Indeed, in all but the name, war existed with France. It was called a quasi-war. Lawrence's first service was a cruise to the West Indies in the Ganges, a 24-gun ship then commanded by Captain Tingey. He showed in this and other voyages such aptitude for his duties that he was made an acting lieutenant by his commander previous to his receiving his commission from government. In 1802, he was appointed first lieutenant in the Enterprise, of 12 guns, one of the fleet of Commodore Mortis, sent to the Mediterranean to prosecute the war with Tripoli. He particularly distinguished himself in that service by his adventures with Lieutenant David Porter, of the New York, in an attack in open day on certain coasters or feluccas laden with wheat, which took refuge in Old Tripoli, where they were defended by a land force. The attack was made in boats, at close quarters, under a heavy fire of the enemy. Lawrence had a second opportunity of distinguishing himself in this war, in an action likely to be better remembered by the public, the glorious adventure of Decatur, in the destruction of the wrecked and captured Philadelphia in the harbor of Tripoli in February 1804. Lawrence was the first lieutenant of that officer in this brilliant adventure, and shared its full dangers and glories. Lawrence was also engaged in the enterprise, in Preble's bombardment of Tripoli the same year. He returned in the winter to the United States with that commodore in the John Adams. In the following spring of 1805, Lawrence successfully carried across the Atlantic one of the fleet of gunboats, No. 6, of which he was commander, destined for service in the Mediterranean. It was a small vessel mounting 2 guns, not at all adapted for ocean navigation. The voyage was looked upon as a marvel. When near the Western Islands, Mr. Cooper, in his Naval History, tells he fell in with the British frigate Lapwing, 28, Captain Upton, which ran for him, under the impression that the gunboat was some wrecked mariners on a raft, there being a great show of canvas and apparently no hull. After the war with Tripoli was ended, Lawrence returned to the United States, and in the interval, when the war with England, after the affair with the Leopard and Chesapeake, was daily becoming more imminent, we find him, in 1808, appointed first lieutenant of the Constitution. About the same time, he married Miss Montediver, the daughter of a respectable merchant of New York. He was on duty in the Vixen, Wasp, and Argus, and, at the commencement of the War of 1812, was promoted to the command of the Hornet. While in this last vessel, he sailed with Bainbridge, who had the flagship Constitution, on a cruise along the coast of South America, and, having occasion to look in at the port of San Salvador, found there the British sloop of war Bon Citoyen, of 18 guns, ready to sail for England with a large amount of specie. Lawrence, whose ship mounted an equal number of guns, was exceedingly anxious to engage with this vessel. He sent a challenge to its commander, Captain Green, through the American consul, inviting him to come out, and pledging his honor that neither the Constitution nor any other American vessel should interfere, which Commodore Bainbridge seconded by promising to be out of the way, or at least non-combatant. The English captain, however, declined. It was an unhappy precedent which Lawrence thus established, injurious to the service, and destined to act fatally against himself in the end, when from the challenger he became the challenged. The Constitution meanwhile sailed away, to close the year with her brilliant engagement with the Java, leaving the Hornet engaged in the blockade of the Bon Citoyen. 18 days since the departure of the flagship had passed, while her consort was thus engaged, waiting till her expected prize should issue from the harbor, when the Hornet was robbed of her chances on victory by the arrival of His Majesty's 74, the Montague. Escape now became the policy of Lawrence, who luckily managed to get from the harbor in safety, and turned his course to the northward along the coast. While cruising in this direction, after capturing a small English brig, he fell in with, on February 24, 1813, off the mouth of the Demerara, 2 brigs of war, with one of which, the Peacock, Captain Peake, he speedily became engaged. The American vessel on this occasion had somewhat the advantage in armament. In the words of Lawrence's dispatch, which gives a modest and forcible account of the affair, after mentioning his attempt to get at the first vessel, he discovered at anchor off the bar, he says, "At 3:30 p.m., I discovered another sail on my weather quarter, edging down for us. At 4:20, she hoisted English colors, at which time we discovered her to be a large man-of-war brig, beat to quarters and cleared ship for action, kept close by the wind, in order, if possible, to get the weather gauge. At 5:10, finding I could weather the enemy, I hoisted American colors and tacked. At 5:20, in passing each other, exchanged broadsides within half pistol shot. Observing the enemy in the act of wearing, I bore up, received his starboard broadside, ran him close on board on the starboard quarter, and kept up such a heavy and well-directed fire that in less than 15 minutes be surrendered, being literally cut to pieces, and hoisted an ensign, Union down, from his forerigging as a signal of distress. The hull of the Peacock was so riddled that she sank, while every exertion was made by her captors to save her by throwing over her guns and stopping the shot holes. 9 of her crew went down with her, and 3 of the Hornet's men. Captain Peake was found dead on board. The loss of the Hornet was trifling compared with that of her adversary, but 1 man killed and 4 wounded or injured, one of whom afterward died. This superiority is attributed by Cooper, who sums up the testimony to the superior gunnery and rapid handling of the Hornet. This victory brought Lawrence a harvest of honors, public and private. Before he sailed, he had felt called upon to protest to the Secretary of the Navy against what he thought an injustice done him in the promotion of a younger officer to a captaincy, while he remained simply lieutenant commander. He now found that the promotion had been conferred upon him in his absence, and was offered the command of the Constitution. He would have been pleased to sail in this vessel, but, much to his annoyance, immediately after receiving the appointment, was ordered to the Chesapeake, then lying at Boston. Captain Lawrence took the command of the Chesapeake at Boston toward the end of May 1813. The Shannon frigate, Captain Broke, a superior vessel of the British Navy, had been for some time off the port, and her commander, assured of his strength, was desirous of a conflict. "You will feel it as a compliment," he wrote, "if I say that the result of our meeting may be the most grateful service I can render to my country. And I doubt not that you, equally confident of success, will feel convinced that it is only by triumphs in equal combats that your little navy can now hope to console your country for the loss of that trade it can no longer protect." It would be complimenting the valor of Lawrence at the expense of his judgment if we were to pronounce him ardent for the fight, with the circumstances under which it took place. In fact, as Mr. Cooper states, he went into the engagement with strong reluctance, on account of the undisciplined state of his crew, to whom he was personally unknown. The challenging vessel, on the contrary, carried a picked crew, with every advantage of discipline and equipment. The presumption, of course, is that he was fully prepared. The armament of the 2 vessels was about equal, mounting 49 guns each. At noon, then, on June 1st, Lawrence weighed anchor and left his station in the bay to proceed to sea with a southwesterly breeze. The Shannon was in sight, and the 2 ships stood off the shore till about 4:30 in the afternoon, when the Chesapeake fired a gun, which was the signal for a series of maneuvers, bringing the vessels within range of each other about 6:15. The Shannon hove to, and the Chesapeake bore down toward her. It was Lawrence's intention to bring his ship fairly alongside of the enemy for a full discharge of his battery. He consequently first received the enemy's fire from the cabin guns, as, the wind having freshened, his ship came up to measure her length with her antagonist, which lay with her head to the southeast. Then the Chesapeake poured in her full fire, inflicting considerable damage, which was repeated in the successive discharges for several minutes. In this commencement of the action, it was considered that the Shannon received most injury, particularly in her hull. Unhappily, the Chesapeake in turn lost the command of her sails. The ship was consequently brought up into the wind, and fell aboard of the enemy, with her mizzen rigging foul of the Shannon's forechains. This accident exposed the Chesapeake to a raking fire, which swept her deck, and, as she was already deprived of the services of the officers who had fallen in the first discharges, her guns in turn were deserted by the men. Captain Lawrence had already received a wound in the leg, his first lieutenant, Ludlow, was wounded, the sailing master was killed, and other important officers were mortally wounded. As the ships became entangled, Lawrence gave orders to summon the boarders, who were ready below, but unhappily, the negro whose duty it was to call them up by his bugle was too much frightened to sound a note. A verbal message was sent, and before it could be executed, Lawrence was a second time struck, receiving a grape shot in his body. The deck was thus left with no officer above the rank of a midshipman. The men of the Shannon now poured in and gained possession of the vessel. As Lawrence was borne below, mortally wounded, his dying thoughts were of his command, uttering his order not to strike the flag of his ship, or some equivalent expression, which is handed down in the popular phrase, "Don't give up the ship." He lingered and died of his wounds on board on June 6th. The Chesapeake was carried into Halifax, and there the remains of her gallant captain were borne from the frigate with military honors, with every mark of respect which a generous enemy could pay to a fallen hero. End of section 18.
Section 19 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Stephen Decatur, by Edward S. Ellis, A.M., 1779-1820. Stephen Decatur was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, Worcester County, January 5, 1779. The family was of French extraction in the paternal line and of Irish on the maternal side. The grandfather was a native of La Rochelle in France and married a lady of Newport, Rhode Island, where Stephen, the son of the Commodore, was born. When a very young man, he removed to Philadelphia and married the daughter of an Irish gentleman named Pine. Decatur was bred to the sea and commanded a merchantman out of the port of Philadelphia until appointed to the sloop of war Delaware. Upon the completion of the frigate Philadelphia, the command of it was given to him. The elder Decatur had one daughter and 3 sons. The daughter was twice married, her first husband having been killed in a duel. The sons were Stephen, James, and John P., all of whom grew to manhood. The boys were educated at the old Philadelphia Academy in 4th Street. Admiral Charles Stewart attended the same school and was an intimate friend of Decatur through life. Many of the incidents of this sketch were received by the writer from Stewart, who fully appreciated the manliness, courage, and nobility of the sailor, now accepted as the foremost type of heroes and founders of the American Navy. Decatur was a born fighter, said Stewart. I never knew a boy so fond of a bout as he. I sat near him at school and have known weeks to pass without a single day in which he did not arrange a contest with one of the boys. We generally adjourned to the Quaker burying ground opposite and had it out among the tombs. Decatur despised meanness of every description and rarely was beaten in a fight. When only 15, he half-killed a partially intoxicated man who insulted his mother and refused to apologize. He never knew when he was whipped. He would hang on like a bulldog. I was a few months older than he, but we were appointed midshipmen in the same year, 1798. Our intimacy was never broken by the slightest incident. Upon entering the Navy in March of the year named, Decatur joined the frigate United States under the command of Commodore Barry, who had obtained the warrant for him. He served with Barry until promoted to a lieutenancy. The United States needed repairs, and not wishing to stay in port, Decatur applied for orders to join the brig Norfolk, then bound to the Spanish Main. After one cruise, he returned again to port and resumed his station on the United States, where he stayed until the naval troubles with France terminated. He was next ordered to the Essex and sailed with Commodore Dale's squadron to the Mediterranean. Returning home once more, he was appointed to the New York, one of the 2nd Squadron under the command of Commodore Mortis. When he again came back, he was ordered to command the Argus, to proceed with her to join Commodore Preble's squadron in the Mediterranean, and on his arrival there to reassign the Argus to Lieutenant Hull and take charge of the schooner Enterprise, then commanded by that officer. The exchange being made, Decatur sailed to Syracuse, where the squadron was to rendezvous. There he learned of the disaster to the Philadelphia. That frigate, as the reader will recall, ran aground while blockading Tripoli, with which country we were at war, and was captured by the Turks. Commodore Bainbridge and his crew of more than 300, among whom were Porter, Jones, and Biddle, were made prisoners and immured in a gloomy dungeon. Decatur quickly formed a plan for capturing or destroying the frigate. Preble, to whom the proposal was submitted, refused at first to give his consent, but his impetuous lieutenant won him over and was allowed to lead the expedition. Decatur selected the ketch Intrepid, which he had captured a few weeks before, and manned her with 70 volunteers, chiefly his own crew. He sailed from Syracuse February 3, 1804, accompanied by the United States brig Siren, Lieutenant Stewart, who was to aid with his boats and to receive the crew of the ketch should it be found expedient to use her as a fire ship. The weather was so tempestuous that it required 15 days to reach the harbor of Tripoli. It was arranged by Decatur and Stewart that the ketch would enter the harbor about 10 o'clock that night, attended by the boats of the Siren. A change of wind threw the Siren 6 or 8 miles away from the Intrepid, and, fearing to wait for the boats, Decatur decided to adventure alone into the harbor, which he did about 8 o'clock. The Philadelphia lay within 1/2 gunshot of the Brashaws Castle and of the principal battery. 2 of the enemy cruisers were only a couple of cable lengths away from the starboard quarter, and their gunboats were within 1/2 gunshot of the starboard bow. All of the guns of the frigate were mounted and loaded. Although it was only 3 miles from the entrance of the harbor to the frigate, the wind was so light that the Intrepid did not get within hail until 11 o'clock. At the distance of 200 yards, the frigate hailed the ketch and ordered her to anchor under the threat of being fired into. Decatur's Maltese pilot, by his direction, replied that they had lost their anchor in a gale of wind off the coast and were unable to do as commanded. When within 50 yards, Decatur sent a small boat with a rope to make fast to the frigate's forechains. This was done, and the Americans began warping the ketch alongside. Not until that moment did the Tripolitans suspect the character of the Intrepid. They were thrown into confusion, during which the 2 vessels came together. Decatur was the first to leap aboard, followed immediately by Midshipman Charles Mortis. A minute passed before their companions could join them, but the Turks were too terrified to sweep the daring officers from the deck, as they might have done in the twinkling of an eye. As soon as Decatur could form a line equal to that of the enemy, the charge was made. 20 of the Turks were killed, many jumped overboard, and the rest scurried into the main deck, whither they were pursued and driven into the hold. The Americans had hardly gained possession of the frigate when a number of launches were seen hurrying about the harbor. Decatur decided that the best defense could be made by staying on the frigate, and he was prepared to receive their attack. Meanwhile, the enemy had opened fire from the batteries and the castle and from 2 corsairs lying near. As the launches did not approach, the lieutenant ordered the ship to be set on fire in several places. The flames spread so fast that it was with the utmost difficulty the Americans were able to reach the ketch. At that critical moment, a propitious breeze sprang up and carried the Intrepid out of the harbor. She had not lost a man, only 4 being wounded. For this exploit, Decatur was promoted to the rank of post captain, there being no intermediate grade. The honor was specially gratifying since the promotion was made with the consent of every officer over whose head he was raised. It should be stated that in that time the rank of captain was the highest in the Navy. A commodore was simply the senior officer of a squadron and might be a master, commandant, a lieutenant, or midshipman. It was decided some weeks later to make an attack on Tripoli. The King of Naples loaned 6 gunboats and 2 Lombards to Commodore Preble. These were formed in 2 divisions, Decatur commanding one and Lieutenant Somers the other. The squadron which sailed from Syracuse included the frigate Constitution, the brig Siren, the schooners Nautilus and Vixen, and the gunboats. Adverse winds deferred the attack for several days. Finally, upon the morning of August 3rd, the weather being favorable, the signal was given from the Commodore's vessel to prepare for action. This signal to open the bombardment was made at 9 o'clock. The gunboats were cast off and advanced in a line ahead, led by Decatur and covered by the frigate Constitution and the brigs and schooners. The enemy's gunboats were moored along the harbor under the batteries and within musket shot. Their sails had been taken from them, and they were ordered to sink rather than abandon their position. They were aided and covered by a brig of 16 and a schooner of 10 guns. Before entering into close action, Decatur went alongside each of the boats and directed them to unship their bowsprits and follow him, as it was his intention to board the enemy's boats. Lieutenant James Decatur commanded one of the boats belonging to Commodore Preble's division, but being farther to the windward than the rest of his division, he joined and took orders from his brother. When Captain Decatur in the leading boat came within range of the batteries, they and the gunboats opened fire. He returned it and pushed his way among the boats. At this juncture, Commodore Preble, fearing the results of Decatur's rashness, ordered the signal to be made for retreat. This command brought to light the singular fact that in making out the signals before going into battle, no one had thought of that which ordered a retreat. It was impossible, therefore, to recall the daring Decatur. The enemy's gunboats contained 40 men each, and ours the same. Decatur had 27 Americans and 13 Neapolitans. On boarding the enemy, the latter held back, but our countrymen charged eagerly forward. 10 minutes sufficed to clear the deck. 8 of the Turks plunged into the hold. Some fell while fighting, and others leaped into the sea. Only 3 of the Americans were wounded. As Decatur was about to withdraw with his prize, his brother's boat came under the stern. The men called to him that they had engaged and captured one of the enemy, but her commander, after surrendering, had treacherously shot Lieutenant James Decatur, pushed off while the crew were recovering the body, and was at that moment making all haste for the harbor. Decatur was infuriated on hearing this, and resolved that the miscreant should not escape. With his single boat, he pressed with all possible speed within the enemy's line, and running aside the offending boat, bounded over the gunwale, followed by 11 Americans, all that were left to him. Then followed the most desperate hand-to-hand fight conceivable, the issue being in doubt for 20 minutes. There have been many accounts of Decatur's exploit on this Tripolitan gunboat, with considerable variation as to the particulars. That which follows is the story as it was told to me by Admiral Stewart, who received it from Decatur himself immediately after the fight. Decatur presented the weapon, called an espitoon, to Stewart, and I naturally examined it with great interest. The handle was of ivory, and the blade perhaps 8 or 10 inches long, being very narrow and curved like a scimitar. It had no edge, was sharply pointed, and evidently made for thrusting. Nothing could stay the fury of Decatur. He immediately identified the commander by his immense size and gorgeous uniform. He eagerly sought out the American, and they instantly came together in the fight to the death. Decatur had a cutlass, and the Turk a pike. The latter inflicted a slight wound on Decatur's breast, and in parrying the stroke, his sword broke off at the hilt. Flinging the weapon aside, the American sprang like a tiger at his antagonist. The two fell to the deck, Decatur under and flat on his back. The Turk had the weapon I have described in the front of his sash and attempted to withdraw it to give the finishing thrust. Decatur flung his legs over his back and with one arm held his enemy so tight against his body that he could not force his hand between. In this position, Decatur, with his free arm, drew a pistol from near his hip, reached over the back of the Turk, and fired downward, directly toward himself. It was just like Decatur, said Stewart. The chances were 10 to 1 that the bullet would pass through both their bodies, but luckily it met bone, and the huge barbarian rolled off dead. The two were half smothered by others fighting and tumbling over them, and it was with the utmost difficulty that Decatur freed himself from them and rose to his feet. While this fierce struggle was going on, a Turk fought his way forward and aimed a fearful blow at Decatur, who was not aware of his danger. Reuben Jones, an American sailor, so desperately wounded that he could not use his arms, flung himself between them and received the blow on his skull, which was fractured. It is a pleasure to record, however, that the brave fellow finally recovered and lived many years on a pension from his government. Decatur succeeded in withdrawing with both prizes, and the next day was honored with the highest commendation in general orders from Commodore Preble. When the latter was superseded in command of the squadron, he gave the command of the Constitution to Decatur, who had some time before received his commission. From that ship he was removed to the Congress, returning home on her on the conclusion of peace with Tripoli. Decatur was next employed as superintendent of gunboats, and March 6, 1806, was married to Miss Susan Wheeler of Norfolk, the only child of wealthy and cultured parents. The union was a most happy one, though no children were born to the couple. In the month of June 1807, the British frigate Leopard, while cruising off the coast of Virginia, poured several broadsides into the American frigate Chesapeake, commanded by Captain James Barron. England, as it will be remembered, insisted on the, quote, right of search, end quote, and the British Captain Humphreys claimed that the American had several English deserters on board. The Chesapeake had 3 men killed and 18 wounded, and, being unprepared for action, struck her colors. Captain Barron was court-martialed and sentenced to 5 years' suspension without pay from the service for what was deemed a cowardly act on his part. Commodore Decatur succeeded him in command of the ship, being transferred to the United States when she was again put in commission. October 25, 1812, in latitude 29 degrees north, longitude 29 degrees 30 minutes west, Decatur fell in with the British ship Macedonian of 49 carriage guns, the odd one shifting. This frigate was the largest of her class, 2 years old, 4 months out of dock, and reputed one of the best sailors in the English service. Taking advantage of the wind, the enemy fought at her own distance. The battle lasted 1 hour and 50 minutes. The United States poured such an incessant fire into the Macedonian that the shouts of her crew were plainly heard. She lost her mizzenmast, fore and main topsails, and main yard, and was much damaged in the hull. Her official list was 36 killed and 48 wounded, that of the Americans being 5 killed and 7 wounded. Decatur could have continued his cruise, but was obliged to accompany his crippled prize into port, where she was equipped as an American frigate. The young officer, as may be supposed, was hailed by the country as its foremost naval hero. Congress and several of the states voted him valuable testimonies for his gallantry. Decatur's conflict with the Algerine at Tripoli. The following year, Decatur attempted to gain the open sea from New York through the Long Island Sound with the Macedonian and Hornet. A British squadron of superior force, however, compelled him to run into the Thames River in Connecticut, and he lay off New London for months, unable to get to sea. He was naturally impatient at being thus cooped up, and bitterly complained that traders on shore, by means of blue lights, warned the enemy whenever at night he prepared to break out of his imprisonment. He sent a challenge to Commander Sir Thomas Hardy of the blockading squadron, offering to fight 2 of the British frigates with 2 of his own, but the offer was declined, and Decatur's frigates were afterwards dismantled. Returning to New York, he assumed command of a squadron bound for the East Indies and put to sea in the President. January 14, 1815, through the blunder of his pilot, his ship heavily grounded while going out. The next morning, Decatur discovered the British squadron in pursuit, consisting of the Majestic Razee, the Endymion, Tenedos, and Pomona frigates, and a brig. Of these, the Endymion was the fleetest. After drawing her away from the rest, Decatur turned and attacked her. She was crippled and her battery silenced when the American resumed her flight. By this time, however, the other ships had come up and opened fire. Escape was impossible, and Decatur surrendered to the British squadron. Returning to the United States under parole, he was dispatched to the Mediterranean on the conclusion of peace to punish the Algerine pirates that were preying upon our commerce. He did his work thoroughly and well, compelling the Dey to sign the most humiliating treaty ever made with a Christian nation. He obtained similar redress at Tunis and Tripoli. Decatur was subsequently created Navy Commissioner and made his residence in Washington at Kalorama, formerly occupied by Joel Benton. Commodore Barron's suspension began February 8, 1808. He resorted to the merchant service and was abroad when war was declared. His suspension terminated about 8 months afterward, sometime after which he reported himself to the Navy Department by letter for duty, the war continuing 2 years after his becoming available for command. He did not return to the United States until the close of 1818. He declared that he had used every effort to reach home before, during hostilities, but was prevented. A court presided over by Captain Charles Stewart afterward declared its judgment that such an effort had not been made by Barron. The latter felt resentful towards Decatur and called him to account for certain expressions he had been told were used by him, reflecting upon his conduct as an officer. When appealed to, Decatur, as Navy Commissioner, declared that he held no personal enmity towards Barron. He deemed it unjust to others of the Navy that his request to be restored to command should be granted. Barron opened a sharp correspondence with Decatur, which continued nearly a year. Mutual friends, or rather enemies, fanned the trouble between them, which ended in a challenge from Barron, which was promptly accepted by Decatur. The duel took place at Bladensburg on the morning of March 22, 1820. Commodore Bainbridge was Decatur's second, and Captain Jesse D. Elliott served Barron in a similar capacity. Decatur chivalrously surrendered his right to name the distance, which Barron made the shortest possible, 8 paces, on account of his defective eyesight. Decatur was without a superior as a pistol shot, and, declaring that he did not wish the life of his antagonist, he said he would only wound him in the hip. At the word "two," both fired so exactly together that only one report was heard. Barron was struck in the right hip, as Decatur intended, and sank to the ground. Decatur stood erect a moment, and was seen to turn pale, compress his lips, and press his hand against his side. Then he fell, the ball having passed through his abdomen. "I am mortally wounded," he said, "and wish that it had been in the defense of my country." His attendants helped him to his feet and started slowly towards the waiting carriage. His pain was so great that after a few paces he sank exhausted near where Barron was stretched on the ground. While the two thus lay near each other, waiting to be carried off, they shook hands, and each freely forgave the other. Decatur was lifted into the carriage, which reached Washington at 10:30. He would not allow himself to be carried into his home until his wife and 2 nieces were sent to the upper floor, where they could not see the dreadful sight. Wishing to save the distracted ones from the grief of witnessing his suffering, he refused them permission to enter the room where he lay. The news caused consternation and sorrow in Washington, where no man was more honored and loved than he. He thanked his friends for their sympathy, told them he had not long to live, signing his will. "I am a dying man," said he, "and only regret that my wound was not received on the quarter-deck in the service of my country." When the surgeons proposed to probe for the bullet, he said it was not worth while, as it had done all the harm it could. He remarked that he did not believe it possible for a person to suffer so much pain and yet live, but not once did he utter a groan. His agony was beyond description and did not cease until 10:30, when he died. It seemed as if the whole male population of Washington and the adjacent county were present at the funeral, besides most of the officers of the government, members of Congress, and resident foreign ministers. The National Intelligencer, in an extra, said, "A hero has fallen. Commodore Stephen Decatur, one of the first officers of our Navy, the pride of his country, the gallant and noble-hearted gentleman, is no more. He expired a few minutes ago of the mortal wound received in the duel this morning. Mourn, Columbia, for one of thy brightest stars is set, a son without fear and without reproach, in the fullness of his fame, in the prime of his usefulness, has descended into the tomb." End of section 19. Section 20 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 2, by Charles F. Horne. Oliver Hazard Perry, 1785 to 1819. Oliver Hazard Perry was born in Rhode Island, August 23, 1785. The late Commodore Mackenzie of the Navy, who possessed what we may term a fine biographical facility, has traced in his interesting narrative the life of Perry, with fond minuteness, the early incidents of the boy's career. The chief characteristics, he tells us, were an uncommon share of beauty, a sweetness and gentleness of disposition which corroborated the expression of his countenance, and a perfect disregard of danger, amounting to apparent unconsciousness. This biographer gives some curious anecdotes of his schooldays. Suffice it to say that the family removing to Newport about this time, Perry found good opportunities of education at that place, and availed himself of them in a manly spirit. He was especially instructed in mathematics and their application to navigation and nautical astronomy. As proof of the boy's ingenuousness and the interest he excited in intelligent observers, it is related that Count Rochambeau, the son of the General of the Revolution, then residing at Newport, was particularly attracted to him, and that Bishop Seabury, on his visitation, marked him as a boy of religious feeling. These traits which shaped the man, we shall find them reappearing in the maturity of Perry's life, in his worth, humanity, and refinement. The boy was but 13 when his father, in 1798, was called into the naval service of his country in the spirited effort made by President Adams to resist the aggressions of France upon the ocean. He took the command of a small frigate, built under his direction in Rhode Island, named the General Greene, and carried with him to sea his son Oliver as a midshipman, at the express solicitation of the youth. The General Greene was actively employed in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, giving all its officers abundant opportunity for practice in the infant service. The French war flurry after a while blew over, as the Directory, the mainspring of these aggressions, lost power. Peace was patched up, and Jefferson shortly after inaugurated an unwholesome Pacific policy by a sweeping reduction of the Navy, as if it were not small enough already. In this mutilating operation, the elder Perry was dropped, the younger one fortunately retained. The Navy, however, was soon revived by the demands of the nation to resist the iniquitous and insulting depredations upon life and property inflicted by the Barbary powers. The United States had borne far too patiently with these injuries, though she had the honor of being in advance of the old powers of Europe in resisting them. The Mediterranean became the scene of many a chivalrous exploit of our early officers, a score of whom, headed by Preble, Bainbridge, Decatur, Somers, and others of that stamp of fiery and indomitable valor, gained immortal laurels by their deeds of daring in conflict with the infidel. The young Perry served as midshipman in the frigate Adams, which sailed from Newport in 1802 to join Commodore Mortis's command at Gibraltar. His ship was for some time employed in blockading a Tripolitan at that port, a tedious but instructive service in maneuvering, at the close of which Perry, in consequence of his accomplishments, was promoted by his captain to the duties of a lieutenant. The frigate was then employed as a convoy, making the tour of the northern ports. This gave Perry an opportunity to study scenes of the Old World, which can never lose their influence in the formation of a man of education and refinement. In 1809, Perry got to sea in command of an armed schooner, the Revenge, which was employed on the coast service. While on the southern coast, he had an opportunity to gain distinction, which he did not fail to avail himself of in cutting out a stolen American vessel from under the guns of a British ship in the Spanish waters off Florida. Conveying his prize off the coast, he was threatened by His Majesty's ship Gore of double his force, when, having, as Mackenzie says, no idea of being leopardized, he put his little schooner in readiness for boarding at a moment's notice, a spirited resolution of great bravery, which he would no doubt have carried out had the British vessel insisted upon overhauling the Revenge. While engaged in cruising off Connecticut and Rhode Island in the beginning of 1811, he unfortunately lost his vessel, through the error of the pilot, on the Watch Hill Reef opposite Fisher's Island, as he was sailing from Newport to New London. Every seamanlike effort was made to save the vessel, and when all was unavailing, Perry showed equal skill and resolution in landing the crew in a heavy January swell with a violent wind. He was himself the last to leave the vessel. He was not merely acquitted of neglect, but his conduct was extolled by a court of inquiry. He was, of course, thrown temporarily out of command by the loss of his vessel, an interval of repose which he hastened to turn to account by forming a matrimonial alliance with Miss Elizabeth Champlain Mason, of an influential family at Newport, to whom he had become engaged several years before, on his arrival from the Mediterranean. The wedding took place in May 1811, affording him ample opportunity for the honeymoon, previous to the actual outbreak of the war impending with England. This event found him at Newport with the rank of Master Commandant, in charge of the flotilla of gunboats keeping watch in the harbor. It was a service not altogether adapted to satisfy the ambitious spirit of a young officer, but it was important in itself and became, in Perry's hands, a step to further eminence. His course at this time illustrates a valuable truth, that no honorable employment is profitless to a man of genius. He will in some way turn it to account. Constructing gunboats and recruiting men in port were services not calculated to make any great blaze in a dispatch, but they conducted Perry to his glorious bulletins of victory and the resounding praises of the nation. He saw a new field of military operations opening on the lakes, and his experienced eye must have seen as well the certain difficulties as the possible honors of the situation. It was not the post which an officer with the claims of Perry would have sought. While brilliant victories were being won in the eye of the world on the vast theater of the ocean, others, however, were before him on that element. Despairing of a command at sea, he offered himself to Commodore Chauncey, who had recently been placed at the head of the lake service. His character was understood by this officer, and the proffer accepted. The necessary communications were made to the government, and in the middle of February in 1813 he was ordered to join Chauncey at Sackett's Harbor with the picked men of his Newport flotilla. He lost no time in reporting himself at the appointed spot. His destination was Lake Erie, where he was to supervise the construction of 2 vessels to be employed in the next campaign, and he was anxious to get to work. But Chauncey, who felt the need of his aid, detained him for a while on Lake Ontario. He, however, toward the end of March, reached Erie, where the vessels were building. His experience in constructing gunboats at Newport was now of avail to him. He put the defense of the works, which had been greatly neglected, in a state of efficiency, and set himself to the collection of supplies, workmen, and an armament. No easy order in that day and in that place in the wilderness, for such, as compared with our own time, it then was. The labors of Perry in this work of preparation were, in fact, of the most arduous character. They should not be forgotten as a heavy item to his credit in the sum total of his victory. 3 gunboats and 2 brigs were launched and equipped in May. It was at this time that he received advices that Chauncey was about to make an attack on the British post of Fort George at the mouth of the Niagara River. He had been promised a share in this adventure and hastened to the scene. The incidents of this journey show the spirit of the man. In his own words, in a letter describing this passage of his life, "On the evening of May 23rd, I received information about sunset that Commodore Chauncey would in a day or 2 arrive at Niagara, when an attack would be made on Fort George. He had previously promised me the command of the seamen and marines that might land from the fleet. Without hesitation, I determined to join him. I left Erie about dark in a small 4-oared open boat. The night was squally and very dark. After encountering headwinds and many difficulties, I arrived at Buffalo on the evening of the 24th, refreshed, and remained there until daylight. I then passed the whole of the British lines in my boat, within musket shot. Passing Strawberry Island, several people on our side of the river hailed and beckoned me on shore. On landing, they pointed out about 40 men on the end of Grand Island, who doubtless were placed there to intercept boats. In a few moments I should have been in their hands. I then proceeded with more caution. As we arrived at Schlosser, it rained violently. No horse could be procured. I determined to push forward on foot, walked about 2.5 miles, when the rain fell in such torrents I was obliged to take shelter in a house at hand. The sailors, whom I had left with the boat, hearing of public horses on the commons, determined to catch one for me. They found an old passing one which could not run away, and brought him in, rigged a rope from the boat into a bridle, and borrowed a saddle without either stirrup, girth, or crupper. Thus accoutred, they pursued me, and found me at the house where I had stopped. The rain ceasing, I mounted. My legs hung down the sides of the horse, and I was obliged to steady the saddle by holding by the mane. In this style I entered the camp. It was raining again most violently. Colonel Porter, being the first to discover me, insisted upon taking my horse, as I had some distance to ride to the other end of the camp, off which the Madison lay. Having thus reached headquarters, arrangements were rapidly made, and the landing of the troops assigned to Perry. In the ignorance or inexperience of some of the officers, there was considerable confusion in directing the boats in the river, which was remedied by Perry's vigilance and decision. He was everywhere in the midst of danger, guiding and directing. The unexpected attack of the British was met by his energy, the landing effected, and the object of the expedition accomplished. This victory opened the port of Black Rock, where several American vessels were collected, which Perry undertook to get into Lake Erie against the strong current of the river, a feat which was accomplished with extraordinary fatigue, so that he returned to his station at Erie with a respectable addition of 5 vessels to his own newly launched little fleet in that harbor. The American force was composed of the brigs Lawrence and Niagara, of 20 guns each, and 7 smaller vessels, numbering in all 54 guns. Captain Barclay, commander of the British forces on the lake, had the Detroit, of 19 guns, the Queen Charlotte, Lady Provost, and 3 other vessels, numbering altogether 63 guns. The range of the enemy's guns gave them advantage at a distance when the corresponding American fire was ineffectual. The Americans, too, were under a disadvantage in the enfeebled state of the crews by the general illness which prevailed among them. The British force had undoubtedly the superiority in trained men as compared with Perry's extemporized miscellaneous command and untried junior officers. The latter proved, however, to be of the right material. On the morning of the engagement, the American fleet was among the islands off Malden at Putnam Bay, when the British force bore up. There was some difficulty at first in clearing the islands, and the nature of the wind seemed likely to throw Perry upon the defensive, when a southeast breeze springing up enabled him to bear down upon the enemy. This was at 10 o'clock on a fine autumnal morning. Perry arranged his vessels in line, taking the lead in his flagship, the Lawrence, on which he now raised the signal for action, a blue flag inscribed in large white letters, with the words of the dying Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship." He accompanied this movement with an appeal to his men. "My brave lads, this flag contains the last words of Captain Lawrence. Shall I hoist it?" "Aye, aye, sir," was the willing response. In this way he cheered the men in the awful pause. A dead silence of an hour and a half preceded the action, for in the light breeze the vessels were long in overcoming the intermediate distance of several miles. Perry, who knew the perils of the day, prepared his papers as if for death. He leaded the public documents in readiness to be cast overboard, and, a touching trait of these moments, gave a hurried perusal to his wife's letters, and tore them to pieces lest they should be read by the enemy. The awful silence is suddenly broken by a bugle sounding on board the Detroit, and the cheers of the British seamen. A shot from that vessel fell short of its mark. The Lawrence bears on to meet the fire, accompanied by the other vessels of the command in appointed order, each destined for its appropriate antagonist. At noon, the British fire from the superior long guns was telling fearfully on the American force, when Perry made all sail for close quarters, bringing the Lawrence within reach of the Detroit. He maintained a steady, well-directed fire from his carronades, assisted by the Scorpion and Ariel. The destruction on the deck of the Lawrence was fearful. Out of 100 well men, says Mackenzie, who had gone into action, 22 were killed and 61 wounded. We shall not insult the humanity of the reader by the details of this fearful carnage. It has probably never been exceeded in the terrors of the dying deck in naval warfare. In the midst of this storm of conflict, Perry, finding his ship getting disabled and seeing the Niagara uninjured at a safe distance, resolved to change his flag to that vessel. He had half a mile to traverse, exposed to the fire of the enemy in an open boat. Nothing deterred, with the exclamation, "If a victory is to be gained, I'll gain it." He made the passage, part of the time standing as a target for the hostile guns. 15 minutes were passed exposed to this plunging fire, which splintered the oars and covered the boat with spray. The Lawrence, stripped of her officers and men, was compelled to surrender. Perry instantly bore up to the Detroit, the guns of which were plied resolutely, when she became entangled with her consort, the Queen Charlotte, and the Niagara poured a deadly fire into both vessels. This cannonade decided the battle in 7 minutes, when the enemy surrendered. The American loss in this engagement was 27 killed and 96 wounded. That of the British, 41 killed and 94 wounded. Gallant actions were performed and noble men fell on both sides. It was every way a splendid victor, placing the genius of Perry and his magnanimous, spirited conduct throughout in the highest rank of naval exertion. The memorable letters, brief, at once eloquent and modest, which he wrote that afternoon announcing his victory, are too characteristic to be omitted in any personal account of the man. Addressing General Harrison, he writes, "Dear General, we have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours, with very great respect and esteem, O. H. Perry." The other was to the Secretary of the Navy. "Sir, it has pleased the Almighty to give to the arms of the United States a signal victory over their enemies on this lake. The British squadron, consisting of 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop, have this moment surrendered to the force under my command, after a sharp conflict. I have the honor to be, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, O. H. Perry." In consonance with this simple eloquence, the mark of a mastermind was his chivalrous care of his wounded and conduct towards his prisoners. The victory having been gained and the lake thus cleared of the foe, Perry was enabled to act in concert with General Harrison in driving the British from Michigan, and when his fleet was of no avail to follow them in their rapid flight, he joined that officer's land expedition and was present, acting as his aide at the Battle of the Thames. "The appearance of the brave Commodore," writes Harrison in his official report, "cheered and animated every heart." Perry also gained the gratitude of the Moravians, in whose district the contest took place, by his care in relieving the inevitable evils of war. He met everywhere on his homeward route with complimentary toasts and resolutions, gathering volume as he reached his native state, where he was received at Newport with military and civic honors. The city of New York paid him a grateful attention in a request communicated by DeWitt Clinton, then mayor, to sit for his portrait for the Civic Gallery. The portrait was painted by Jarvis, representing him in the act of boarding the Niagara, and is preserved in the City Hall. He was created an honorary member of the Cincinnati. Congress voted him a medal and money. He was dined and feasted, and blazed the comet of the season. Perry's next service was in August 1814, in command of the Java 44, a frigate recently built at Baltimore. He was, however, not able to get to sea in consequence of the blockade by the enemy. On the conclusion of peace, he sailed in this vessel to join Commodore Shaw's squadron in the Mediterranean. In 1819, he sailed as Commodore in command of the John Adams for the West Indies, bound for the state of Venezuela to carry on an armed negotiation for the protection of American commerce from aggressions in that quarter. Arriving at the mouth of the Orinoco, he shifted his flag to the Nonsuch and ascended the river to the capital, Angostura, where he remained 20 days transacting his business in the height of the yellow fever season. His vessel had hardly left the river on her way to Trinidad when he was attacked. For nearly a week he suffered the progress of the terrible disease on board the small schooner under a tropical sun when he reached the station whither he had sent his flagship, the Adams. But he reached port only to die at sea within a mile of the anchorage on August 23, 1819, when he had just completed his 34th year. Such and so early was the fate of the gallant Perry. His remains were interred from the John Adams at Port Spain with every attention by the English governor. Subsequently, they were brought home in a national vessel by the order of Congress and reinterred at the public expense in the cemetery at Newport. The country also provided for the support of his family. If ever America produced a man whom the nation delighted to honor, it was Perry. End of Section 20.